Hey, Pack, gather close, because this one's raw. Picture this: the most feared alpha king in the Northern Territories, a man who could shatter armies with a word, brought to his knees not by steel or strategy, but by his own goddamn mouth. The Night Queen Selene Varellis walked into that blizzard wasn't just another royal scandal. It was the beginning of an empire's death rattle. And if you think you know how this ends, you don't. So buckle up, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is listening. Because what happened in that frozen palace that winter? It'll make you question everything you thought you knew about power, pride, and the woman who refused to break. Let's begin. The argument started over a letter. Not a declaration of war, not a treaty or a threat. Just a single piece of parchment with a wax seal that Lucien Draven didn't recognize, addressed to his queen in handwriting he'd never seen before. He found it on her desk while she was meeting with the city's grain merchants, those desperate bastards begging for royal intervention after the northern roads froze solid for the third week straight. Lucien had gone to her study looking for the border reports, not evidence of treason. But the moment he saw that foreign seal, something ugly and familiar crawled up his spine. He'd been king long enough to know what secrets looked like. By the time Selene returned to their private chambers that evening, her boots tracking melted snow across the stone floor, Lucien had already consumed half a bottle of Thornwood whiskey and convinced himself of her betrayal. He was standing by the window overlooking the frozen capital, watching the city lights flicker like dying stars beneath the snowfall when she entered. She looked exhausted. Her dark hair was pulled back severe and practical, damp strands clinging to her temples. The formal court dress she'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by a simple wool tunic and riding pants because Selene never was one for pretense when the palace doors closed. Even bone-tired, she was the most dangerous woman in the empire. Not because she carried weapons, though she could gut a man faster than most of Lucien's soldiers, but because she carried something far more lethal. She carried the people's love. And Lucien? The people feared him. There was a difference, and he felt it every goddamn day. "You look like you're planning a war," Selene said, her voice carrying that particular edge that meant she'd already sensed the storm brewing. Lucien didn't turn from the window. "Who's Matthias Corvin?" Silence, the kind that fills a room like floodwater. "Excuse me?" Now he turned. The letter was in his hand, crumpled from where his fist had tightened around it while he waited. "The letter on your desk, from someone named Matthias Corvin, uses a seal I don't recognize, which means he's either nobody important or somebody working very hard not to be noticed. So I'll ask again, who the hell is Matthias Corvin, and why is he writing to my queen?" Celine's expression didn't change, but Lucien had been watching her long enough to catch the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers flexed once at her sides. "You went through my private correspondence. I'm the king. Nothing in this palace is private from me." That's convenient logic for a man who keeps half his military strategies locked in a vault I'm not allowed near. Lucien took 3 steps forward, the whiskey making his movements just sloppy enough to broadcast his anger. "Don't deflect, answer the question." She held his gaze without flinching. After 7 years of marriage, she'd learned not to back down when he used that voice, the one that made generals stammer and nobles wet themselves. "Matthias Corvin is a merchant lord from the Eastern Reach. He's been facilitating grain shipments through the mountain passes." Grain shipments. Lucien's laugh was ugly. In the middle of winter, through passes that have been closed for a month. Through passes that would still be closed if I hadn't negotiated with the mountain clans to keep them clear. "You negotiated, without telling me." "I negotiated because you were too busy threatening to burn the Eastern Reach to the ground after their duke refused to send troops for your border campaigns." Celine's voice was rising now, that careful control starting to crack. "Someone had to make sure this city didn't starve while you were measuring your cock against every nobleman who dared question your authority." The slap of her words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Lucien's hand tightened around the letter until the parchment tore. "You made deals with foreign lords behind my back. You undermined my authority. I saved lives!" Celine's shout echoed off the stone walls. "While you were drunk on power and paranoia, I was doing the job you've been too proud to do, actually ruling this empire instead of just terrifying it into submission." Careful, Celine. Or what? She stepped closer. And damn her, she wasn't afraid. She'd never been afraid of him, and that's what had drawn him to her in the first place. That's also what made every fight between them feel like standing on a crumbling cliff edge. You'll throw me in the dungeons? Execute me for treason? Go ahead, Lucien. Show the Empire what kind of king you really are. He wanted to. God help him. Some savage part of his brain wanted to grab her by the throat and make her submit the way everyone else did. But that was the whiskey talking, and the fear, and the sick certainty that she was slipping away from him the same way everything else had. His father's respect, the noble's loyalty, the people's love. Everything he touched turned to ice or blood. I am trying, he said, and hated how his voice cracked on the words, to hold this empire together. Every day I wake up to reports of rebellion, starvation, conspiracy. The nobles want me dead. The common people spit when I ride past. Our enemies circle like wolves waiting for winter to finish us. And you're supposed to be the one person I can trust. The one person who stands with me instead of plotting behind my back. I'm not plotting. Celine's anger had shifted into something colder, more dangerous. I'm surviving, because you've been so consumed with being feared that you forgot how to be followed. And when this empire finally tears itself apart, it won't be because our enemies were stronger. It'll be because you were too goddamn stubborn to accept help. Help? Lucien's laugh was broken glass. Is that what you call secret correspondence with merchant lords? What else haven't you told me, Celine? What other deals have you made? What other letters are hidden in that desk? She stared at him for a long moment, and he watched something shift behind her eyes, something final. You really believe I'd betray you? It wasn't a question. I believe, Lucien said slowly, that everyone betrays everyone eventually. It's just a matter of time and opportunity. Then you've already lost. Celine turned toward the door. Because if you can't tell the difference between betrayal and partnership, between loyalty and blind obedience, then you're not a king. You're just a tyrant waiting for his empire to collapse. Don't you dare walk away from me. She paused, her hand on the door handle. Or what? You'll command me to stay? You'll force me to watch while you destroy everything we've built because you're too paranoid to see the truth? She looked back at him, and there were no tears in her eyes. That somehow made it worse. I've stood beside you through wars, famines, and uprisings. I've defended you to nobles who wanted your head and common folk who feared your shadow. I've loved you even when you made it almost impossible to do so. But I will not stand here and let you accuse me of treason when my only crime was caring about this empire enough to save it from your pride. Celine, I'm done, Lucien. I'm done being your punching bag every time you're scared. I'm done justifying my every action like I'm some prisoner awaiting judgment. I'm done breaking myself into smaller pieces just to fit inside the cage you've built. She opened the door. The blizzard was getting worse outside. He could hear the wind shrieking against the palace walls like something ovoid and furious. The temperature had dropped so low that guards were being rotated every 20 minutes to prevent frostbite. No one in their right mind would venture out into that frozen hell. If you leave now, Lucien said, his voice barely above a whisper, don't come back. Celine stopped in the doorway. Snow was already blowing in from the corridor, catching in her hair like accusations. You don't mean that. I've never meant anything more in my life. The lie tasted like poison, but pride was a sickness he'd never learned to cure. Walk out that door and you're no longer my queen, no longer my wife. You'll be nothing but another traitor who abandoned her kingdom when it needed her most. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Goodbye, Lucien, she said quietly. I hope your pride keeps you warm. Then she was gone, and Lucien was alone with the bottle and the broken letter and the growing certainty that he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. But kings didn't chase after queens like lovesick boys. Kings stood their ground and let the empire burn, if that's what it took to prove a point. So Lucien poured another drink and told himself he'd done the right thing, even as the wind screamed and the city below froze solid, and somewhere in that howling darkness, the woman who'd been the only light in his world disappeared into the storm. By morning, the capital looked like a mass grave. Lucien stood on the palace balcony watching his guards dig through snowdrifts taller than horses, searching for bodies of citizens who'd been caught outside when the blizzard hit. They'd already found 17. The physician predicted they'd find at least 30 more before noon. The Queen's personal guard, Captain Vera Stormborn, found Lucienne still standing there an hour past dawn. She was a brick wall of a woman, scarred from a decade of military service, and one of the few people in the palace who'd dare speak to him without being spoken to first. "The Queen's chambers are empty," Vera said without preamble. "Her winter cloak is gone, so are her boots and traveling gloves." Lucienne didn't turn around. "She left during the blizzard?" "Appears so, Your Majesty." "Alone?" "No one from her guard is missing, so yes, alone." The word hit him like a fist to the gut. Celine had walked into a killing storm without protection, without backup, without even a goddamn horse because the stables would have been locked for the night. She'd simply left because he'd told her to. "Organize search parties," Lucian said. His voice sounded distant, mechanical. "Every available guard. Start with the main roads leading out of the capital, then expand to, Already done, sir. Been searching since we realized she was gone. No sign of her yet, but the snow's still coming down heavy. Even tracks would be buried by now." Lucian's hands gripped the balcony railing hard enough to hurt. "She couldn't have gotten far in that storm. She's smart enough to find shelter." "Permission to speak freely, Your Majesty?" "Granted." Vera's jaw tightened. "The Queen is one of the toughest women I've ever served under, but no one survives a night like that without preparation. Temperature dropped below freezing before midnight, wind strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet, and she left upset, which means she wasn't thinking clearly." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we might be looking for a body instead of a person, sir." The words should have broken him. Instead, they just made him angry. That hot, irrational fury that had gotten him through battles and political coups and every other nightmare his life had thrown at him. Anger was easier than grief. Anger had always been easier. "Keep searching," he said, "and send word to every outpost, every village, every farmhouse within a day's ride. Someone had to have seen her." "Yes, Your Majesty." Vera started to leave, then paused. "Sir? What do I tell people when they ask why the Queen left?" Lucian finally turned to look at her. "Tell them the truth, that their king is a paranoid fool who drove away the only person keeping this empire from tearing itself apart." Vera's expression didn't change, but he caught the flash of something in her eyes. Pity, maybe, or disgust. Hard to tell the difference anymore. After she left, Lucien went back inside and did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the chapel. Not to pray. He'd given up on gods around the same time his father had beaten religion out of him with a belt and a speech about how divine right was just a story weak kings told themselves. But the chapel was quiet, and Lucien needed quiet the way drowning men need air. He sat in the front pew and stared at the altar and tried to remember the last time he'd told Celine he loved her. Months, probably. Maybe longer. He'd gotten so good at taking her presence for granted, assuming she'd always be there no matter how badly he treated her, no matter how many times he chose his pride over her counsel. The chapel door opened behind him. "Not now," Lucian said without turning. "You need to see this." It was Lord Heron, his master of spies. A weasel of a man who Lucien barely trusted but couldn't afford to dismiss. "It's about the Queen." Lucian was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. "You found her?" "No, Your Majesty, but I found something else." Heron held out a leather journal, expensive and well-worn. One of the maids discovered this hidden in the Queen's study, behind a false panel in her desk. Every instinct screamed at Lucien not to take it. Whatever was in that journal would either prove his paranoia right or destroy what little remained of his sanity. But kings didn't get to look away from hard truths. He took the journal. The entries started almost 2 years ago, written in Celine's precise handwriting. The first few pages were innocuous, notes about crop yields, tax revenues, citizen complaints, the kind of administrative details that Lucien had always been too busy with military campaigns to bother tracking. Then he found the section about the Eastern Reach negotiations. His hands started shaking as he read. Celine hadn't just been negotiating grain shipments. She'd been building an entire shadow network of trade agreements, diplomatic channels, and strategic alliances with territories Lucien had written off as hostile. She'd been doing it for years, carefully and quietly, working around his aggressive foreign policy to keep supply lines open and prevent outright war. Every letter from Matthias Corvin was documented. So were dozens of others from merchants, minor nobles, even a few enemy commanders who'd agreed to ceasefire arrangements in exchange for food and medicine. She'd been running her own foreign policy behind his back. But as Lucian kept reading, the paranoia that had fueled his rage the night before started crumbling into something worse. Everything she'd done, every secret deal, every hidden correspondence, had been to protect the Empire, to compensate for his failures, to keep people alive while he'd been too obsessed with displays of power to notice his kingdom was starving. There were pages of notes about which nobles were plotting against him, detailed warnings about Lord Malric Thorne's suspicious behavior, his unexplained wealth, his growing influence among the court. Celine had been investigating Malric for months, gathering evidence of embezzlement and treason, evidence that Lucian had been too blind to see because Malric had always told him exactly what he wanted to hear. Near the end of the journal, he found an entry from 3 nights ago. Lucien grows more paranoid by the day. I can see his father's madness taking root, the same suspicion that destroyed the last king turning my husband into something I barely recognize. I'm running out of ways to protect him from himself. The Empire is fracturing, and the man I married is too consumed by fear to see the real threats. Malric is positioning himself for a coup. I have evidence, but Lucien won't hear anything that contradicts his trusted advisor. If I push too hard, he'll think I'm the traitor. If I don't push hard enough, we'll all be dead before spring. I don't know how to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. I don't know how to love someone who only knows how to destroy. The journal fell from Lucian's hands. Your Majesty? Heron's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you? Get out. But sir, there's more information about... Get out! Heron scrambled backward and fled, leaving Lucien alone with the evidence of his catastrophic stupidity. She'd been trying to save him. The whole time, while he'd been accusing her of betrayal, she'd been working herself to exhaustion trying to hold together an empire that he'd been systematically destroying with his paranoia and pride. And he'd called her a traitor. He'd sent her into a blizzard. He might have killed the only person in the world who'd ever given a damn whether he lived or died. Lucien walked back to the balcony and looked out over his frozen capital. The search parties were still combing through snowdrifts. The bodies were being lined up in the courtyard like cordwood. And somewhere out in that white hell, Celine was either dead or dying, and it was his fault. For the first time in 20 years, the Alpha King of the Northern Empire started to cry. Heat. The search went on for 3 days. They found nothing. No body, no tracks, no sign that Queen Celine Varelis had ever existed except for the hole she'd left behind in the palace and the city and Lucian's chest where his heart used to be. On the 4th day, the rebellion started. House Corvain in the Western Territories declared independence, claiming the king had murdered his own queen and could no longer be trusted. House Brecken in the south followed suit, using the chaos as cover to seize 3 major trade cities. The Eastern Lords, the ones Celine had been carefully negotiating with, closed their borders and recalled their diplomats. Within a week, the Northern Empire had fractured into a dozen warring factions, all of them circling like sharks around a wounded king. Lucien barely noticed. He spent his days in Celine's study, reading through her journals and correspondence, piecing together the intricate web of diplomacy and strategy she'd been building while he'd been playing tyrant. Every page was another knife to the gut. Every entry about his failures, his blindness, his cruelty, was a truth he couldn't escape. At night, he walked the frozen streets of the capital himself, searching for any sign of her. His guards tried to stop him the first few times, too dangerous, too undignified for a king. But after he broke Captain Vera's nose during one argument, they learned to just follow at a distance. The people recognized him, even bundled in a common cloak against the cold. They always recognized him, but instead of fear, he saw something new in their eyes. Contempt. They blamed him for Celine's disappearance. They were right to. On the 10th day, Lord Malric Thorne made his move. Lucien was in the throne room reviewing what remained of his military forces when Malric entered with an honor guard of 20 soldiers. Not palace guards, private mercenaries wearing Malric's colors. Lord Thorne, Lucien said without looking up from the reports, unless you're here to tell me you found my queen, I'm not interested in whatever scheme you're selling today. I'm afraid I have unfortunate news, Your Majesty. Malric's voice carried that oily sympathy that made Lucian's skin crawl. The council has voted. In light of recent instability, they've decided the Empire needs new leadership. Now Lucien looked up. New leadership. A regent, temporarily, until the crisis passes. Someone to steady the ship while you recover from your grief. And let me guess, you volunteered for this tremendous burden. Malric smiled. It was the smile of a snake that had been waiting years for the mouse to wander close enough. Someone has to think of the Empire's future. Get out. I'm afraid I can't do that, Your Majesty. The soldiers outside are loyal to the Council now. Your personal guard has been relieved of duty. This palace is under new management, effective immediately. Lucien stood slowly, and he saw several of Malric's mercenaries reach for their weapons. Good. Let them be afraid. Fear was the one language Lucien still spoke fluently. You can try to take my throne, Lucien said quietly, but you should know something first. I've spent the last 10 days reading my wife's journals, every single entry, including the ones about you. Malric's smile faltered slightly. I don't know what. She documented everything. The embezzlement, the forged trade contracts, the weapons you've been smuggling to enemy territories, the nobles you've been blackmailing. She even has testimony from 3 of your former associates who you thought were dead. Lucien took a step forward. She knew you were planning this coup, Malric. She tried to warn me, but I was too goddamn stupid to listen. Those are lies fabricated by a desperate woman trying to... She's been protecting this empire while you've been poisoning it, and I was so busy being paranoid about her loyalty that I couldn't see the real traitor standing right in front of me. Malric's hand moved to his sword. It doesn't matter what she wrote. She's gone, and you're finished. The nobles will support my claim to... Lucien moved. 20 years of combat training, a decade of warfare, and 10 days of grief-fueled rage compressed into 3 seconds of pure violence. He crossed the space between them before Malric could draw his weapon, grabbed the traitor by the throat, and slammed him against the marble pillar hard enough to crack stone. The mercenaries surged forward, but Lucien's voice stopped them cold. I am still your king, he roared, and the throne room seemed to shake with it. And the first man who draws steel dies where he stands. They hesitated. That was their mistake. Captain Vera burst through the side entrance with 50 royal guards, the real ones, loyal to the crown, not Malric's bought and paid for mercenaries. Within seconds, the throne room was a standoff, steel drawn on both sides, waiting for someone to make the first stupid move. Lucien tightened his grip on Malric's throat. The traitor's face was turning purple, his feet kicking uselessly against the pillar. Here's what's going to happen, Lucien said, his voice deadly calm. You're going to tell me where Celine is, every location you've checked, every lead you've followed. Then you're going to tell me which of these rebellions you've been funding and which nobles are part of your conspiracy. And if you lie, if you even hesitate, I will make your death last for days. I don't know where she is, Malric choked out. I swear, she vanished before you could what? Execute her. Malric's eyes were bulging now. The plan was to capture her, stage an execution, blame it on rebels, but she disappeared before we could... The admission hit Lucien like a battering ram. They'd been planning to kill Celine. Not just remove her, not just exile her, but publicly execute her and use her death to destabilize his rule. And Lucien had played right into their hands by driving her away himself. He'd almost helped them murder his own wife. The rage that filled him then was beyond words, beyond thought, beyond anything resembling human. It was the fury of a king who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. The same fury that had built an empire on blood and bone and terror. Lucien dropped Malric and turned to face the room full of armed men. I am done, he said, and his voice carried the weight of an avalanche, being a prisoner in my own palace. I am done letting cowards and conspirators dictate how I rule. And I am done pretending to be the civilized king my father tried to beat into me. He drew his sword, the blade that had killed more men than he could count, that had carved out an empire from the frozen north. You want my throne, Malric? Come and take it. What happened next would be talked about for decades. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes, but in that time, Lucien reminded his empire why they'd feared him in the first place. He moved through Malric's mercenaries like death itself, all restraint abandoned, every strike designed to kill rather than wound. Blood painted the marble floor, screams echoed off the vaulted ceiling. And when it was over, when the last mercenary had either fled or fallen, Lucien stood in the center of the carnage, with his blade dripping red and his eyes promising damnation to anyone foolish enough to challenge him again. Malric was still alive. Barely. Lucian had made sure of that. "Where?" Lucian said, kneeling beside the broken traitor. "Would you take someone you wanted to hide from me? Somewhere I wouldn't think to look? Somewhere you could hold them until you were ready to make your move?" Malric laughed, bubbles of blood forming on his lips. "You think she's alive? You think anyone survived that storm?" "Answer the question." "The northern cliffs," Malric whispered. "Old fortress. 3 days' ride. That's where I'd keep a prisoner. If I had one." "If?" "She could be dead. In a ditch somewhere. Could be, frozen solid. Could be—" Lucian didn't let him finish. Some deaths were too quick to be satisfying, but he was done playing games. He stood, addressed Captain Vera without looking away from Malric's body. "Arrest every noble who attended yesterday's council meeting. Lock them in the dungeons until I return. Anyone who resists dies. Anyone who runs dies. Anyone who so much as looks at you wrong dies. Am I clear?" "Crystal, Your Majesty." "Good. Then prepare my horse and a squad of your best fighters. We ride for the northern cliffs within the hour." "Sir, we don't even know if she's actually—" "She's alive." Lucian said it like a prayer, like a curse, like the only truth he had left to cling to. "She's alive, and I'm going to bring her home. And if anyone, rebel, traitor, or God himself tries to stop me, I will burn this entire empire to ash before I let them win." He walked out of the throne room without looking back, leaving orders and bodies in his wake. Outside, the snow was still falling, but Lucian Draven no longer gave a damn about the cold. He had a queen to find and a kingdom to save, and he'd be damned if pride or fear or the whole frozen world would stop him from getting both back. The hunt had begun. And somewhere in the frozen north, in an abandoned fortress where traitors kept their darkest secrets, Celine Varelis waited in chains, weak from cold and hunger, but not broken, never broken. She'd survived worse than winter. She'd survived loving an alpha king who didn't know how to love her back. And when Lucian finally found her, when he saw what his failures had cost them both, the real battle would begin. Not against rebels or traitors or the killing cold, but against the demons they'd both been running from since the night the queen vanished and the empire started its long, bloody descent into darkness. The ride north was a descent into hell frozen over. Lucian pushed his men harder than he'd pushed any battalion during wartime, driving through snowdrifts that reached the horses' chests and wind that cut like broken glass. Captain Vera rode beside him with 12 of her best fighters, all of them veterans who'd seen enough combat to know when their king had gone from determined to suicidal. None of them complained. They just kept riding, kept their weapons ready, and tried not to think about what they'd find when they reached the northern cliffs. If they reached the northern cliffs, 3 soldiers had already turned back after frostbite set in so deep their fingers turned black. Lucian hadn't stopped them. He needed men who could fight when they arrived, not corpses weighing down the horses. On the second day, Vera finally broke the silence they'd been riding in since leaving the capital. "You really think she's still alive?" Lucian didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the white horizon, searching for any landmark that might tell him they were getting close. "She has to be." "That's not an answer, sir. It's the only answer I've got." Vera was quiet for a moment, then said, "What happens if we find her, and she doesn't want to come back? What happens if she took one look at the mess you made and decided the empire wasn't worth saving anymore?" The question hit harder than it should have because Lucian had been asking himself the same thing for 2 days straight. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Celine's face in that doorway, saw the exact moment something inside her had given up on him. He'd spent 7 years taking her loyalty for granted, assuming she'd always be there to clean up his mistakes and absorb his rage and love him despite every reason not to. What if he'd finally broken something that couldn't be fixed? "Then I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn her back," Lucian said. "Even if it takes decades, even if she never forgives me. She deserves better than what I gave her, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left proving that I can be the man she needed me to be all along." Vera made a sound that might have been approval or skepticism, hard to tell with the wind howling around them. "You know what the nobles are saying back in the capital? They're saying you've gone soft, that you're letting sentiment cloud your judgment, that a real king would cut his losses and find a new queen instead of chasing ghosts through a blizzard. The nobles can hang themselves with their own entrails for all I care. That's the spirit, sir. They rode in silence after that, pushing deeper into territory that even maps labeled as uninhabitable during winter months. The landscape turned hostile in ways that went beyond mere cold. Frozen rivers that could crack and swallow a horse whole. Cliffs hidden by snowdrifts where one wrong step meant a 100-foot drop. Trees so weighted with ice they'd snap without warning and crush anything underneath. This was the kind of terrain that killed armies. But Lucien had stopped caring about survival somewhere around the time he'd read Celine's journal entries about protecting him from his own madness. If she'd walked into this frozen hell because of him, then he'd walk into it after her. And if it killed him, at least he'd die doing something that mattered instead of sitting on a throne watching his empire rot from the inside. On the third day, they found the fortress. It rose from the cliffs like a diseased tooth, all broken stone and collapsed towers that had probably been abandoned decades ago. No smoke from chimneys, no lights in windows, no sign of life except for the deep tracks in the snow leading to the main gate. Recent tracks, maybe a day old, made by multiple horses in heavy boots. Someone was using this place. Lucien dismounted and drew his sword without being told. Behind him, Vera and her soldiers did the same, forming up in combat positions that spoke of years fighting together. They'd taken fortresses before, knew the rhythm of it, knew how to move quiet and fast and lethal. But Lucien wasn't interested in quiet. He wanted whoever had taken Celine to know he was coming. Wanted them to feel the same terror she must have felt being dragged to this frozen tomb. Wanted them to understand that they'd made a mistake so catastrophic that death would be a mercy compared to what he had planned. The main gate was barred from the inside, but the wood was old and frost-damaged. Lucien kicked it 3 times before the hinges gave way, and the door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and ice. The courtyard beyond was a killing ground waiting to happen. Archers on the walls, maybe 15 of them, already knocking arrows. Soldiers in the courtyard itself, twice that number, wearing mismatched armor that marked them as mercenaries rather than proper military. And standing in the center of it all, looking far too comfortable for a man about to die, was a figure Lucien recognized from Celine's journal entries. Commander Aldrich Voss, formerly of House Corvain, currently wanted for desertion and treason in 3 territories. The same commander who'd been on Malric's payroll for the last 2 years. "Well, well," Voss called out, his voice carrying that particular arrogance of men who thought they held all the cards. "The Mad King himself, I'd heard you were searching for something. Didn't realize it was worth riding to your death over." "Where is she?" Voss smiled. "You'll have to be more specific, Your Majesty. We've entertained several guests here over the winter. Though I suppose you're asking about the woman who used to wear your crown?" "If she's dead," Lucien said quietly, "then you've got about 30 seconds to make peace with whatever afterlife you believe in." "Oh, she's alive. Battered, half frozen, probably wishing she wasn't, but alive. Malric wanted her kept breathing until he could stage a proper execution. Though I suppose those plans changed when you carved through his mercenaries like they were made of paper." Lucien took a step forward. Every archer on the wall tensed. "Let me see her." "I don't think so." Voss gestured at the soldiers surrounding Lucien's small group. "You're outnumbered 5-1, Your Majesty, and even if you somehow managed to cut through all my men, the archers would fill you with arrows before you made it halfway across the courtyard. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop your weapons, surrender peacefully, and join your queen in the dungeons. Then, when the spring thaw comes and Malric's supporters have finished carving up your empire, we'll execute you both and collect our payment." Lucien looked around the courtyard, counting enemies, measuring distances, calculating odds. Vera was right about one thing. This was a suicide mission by any tactical standard. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and one command away from becoming pincushions. But Lucien had stopped caring about tactics the moment he'd realized what his pride had cost him. He raised his sword. The courtyard exploded into violence. Arrows screamed through the air and Lucien was moving before they landed, throwing himself sideways as shafts buried themselves in the snow where he'd been standing. Vera and her soldiers scattered in practiced formation, taking cover behind what little the courtyard offered while returning fire with their own crossbows. 3 archers dropped from the walls before the rest found cover. Lucien didn't wait for support. He charged straight at Voss through the chaos, his blade singing as it cut through the first mercenary stupid enough to get in his way. 20 years of combat training had taught him how to read a battlefield, how to find the weak points in enemy formations, how to kill efficiently and without hesitation. But this wasn't about efficiency. This was about rage and grief, and 7 years of failures crystallizing into a single point of absolute clarity. He was going to save Celine or die trying, and anyone standing between them was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Voss drew his own sword and met Lucian's charge with the confidence of a man who'd survived 100 battles. They came together in a clash of steel that rang out over the sounds of fighting, testing each other, looking for weaknesses. The commander was good, professional soldier good, trained by the Empire's own military before he'd sold his loyalty to the highest bidder. Under normal circumstances, it might have been an interesting fight, but these weren't normal circumstances. Lucien fought like a man with nothing left to lose, every strike designed to overwhelm rather than outthink, using raw aggression to compensate for any technical gaps. He'd learned young that fear was a weapon more effective than any blade, and right now he needed Voss afraid. Needed him to understand what happened when you took something from the Alpha King of the Northern Empire. Their swords met again, and Lucien drove forward, using his weight advantage to force Voss backward step by step. Around them, the battle raged, his soldiers fighting with desperate precision against overwhelming numbers, but Lucien couldn't afford to think about that. Couldn't afford to worry about casualties or tactical retreat or anything except the man in front of him and what that man knew. "Where is she?" Lucien snarled, punctuating each word with a strike that forced Voss to give more ground. "Go to hell." "Wrong answer." Lucien shifted his angle and drove his blade through Voss's shoulder, angling down to avoid anything immediately fatal. The commander screamed and dropped his weapon, collapsing to his knees in the blood-stained snow. Lucien kicked him flat and put a boot on his chest. "I asked you a question." Voss was gasping, his face white with shock and pain, but he managed a laugh that sounded more like choking. "Dungeon. East Tower, Cell 3. But you'll never make it. My men will cut you down before—" Lucien looked up and shouted across the courtyard. "Vera! East Tower, Cell 3. The captain was fighting off 2 mercenaries at once, but she managed to nod and started fighting her way toward the tower entrance. 3 of her soldiers broke off to support her, creating a wedge of violence that cut through the enemy formation. Lucien looked back down at Voss. "How many guards?" 2 at the door. Maybe more inside. "Keys?" "Commander's quarters. Top floor." Lucien increased the pressure on Voss's chest until something cracked. "You're going to give the order to stand down. Tell your men to drop their weapons and surrender." "Or what? You'll kill me?" Voss's laugh turned into a wet cough. "I'm dead anyway. Malric doesn't tolerate failure. Then die knowing you saved your men's lives instead of wasting them on a losing battle." For a moment, Voss just stared up at him with eyes that had seen too many winters and too many betrayals. Then something shifted in his expression, some calculation being made behind the pain. He shouted to his men, "Stand down! Drop your weapons!" The mercenaries hesitated, looking between their dying commander and the mad king standing over him with a bloody sword. A few of the smarter ones dropped their blades immediately. Others needed more convincing, which Lucien's soldiers were happy to provide. Within minutes, the courtyard was secured. Lucien didn't wait for the surrender to be complete. He left Voss bleeding in the snow and ran for the East Tower, taking the crumbling stairs 3 at a time. The 2 guards outside Cell 3 barely had time to register his presence before he cut them down. No hesitation, no mercy, just brutal efficiency born from decades of violence. The cell door was solid oak reinforced with iron, locked from the outside with a mechanism that would have taken precious minutes to pick. Lucien kicked it until the hinges gave way. The cell beyond was dark except for weak light filtering through a barred window too small to escape through. It took his eyes a moment to adjust, to make sense of the shadows and the figure huddled in the corner, wrapped in what might have once been a blanket, but now looked more like a collection of rags held together by ice. Celine. She looked up at the sound of the door crashing open, and Lucien's heart stopped at what he saw. The woman he'd married 7 years ago had been fierce and unbreakable, a force of nature that could stare down armies without flinching. The woman looking at him now was a ghost of that memory. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. Her hands, when she raised them defensively against the sudden light, were shaking so badly she could barely hold them steady. But her eyes, even beaten, even frozen, even staring at the man who'd sent her to this hell, Celine's eyes still held that stubborn fire that had made Lucien fall in love with her in the first place. She didn't speak, just stared at him like she couldn't quite believe he was real. Lucien crossed the cell in 2 steps and dropped to his knees in front of her. Up close, the damage was worse. Someone had beaten her, recently enough that the bruises were still fresh. Her breathing was shallow and labored, suggesting broken ribs. And when he reached out to touch her face, she flinched. That flinch broke something in him that 10 days of grief and guilt hadn't managed to crack. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice came out raw and broken. "Celine, I'm so goddamn sorry." She stared at him for a long moment, then said in a voice like broken glass, "You came." "Of course I came." "Why?" The question was so simple and so devastating that Lucien had to force himself to meet her eyes when he answered, "Because I'm a fool who let his pride destroy the only good thing in his miserable life. Because you deserved better than what I gave you. Because I would burn this entire empire to ash before I'd let them hurt you again." Celine's expression didn't change. "Pretty words, Lucien. You always were good with words when you needed something. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just trying to get you home." "Home." She laughed, and the sound was worse than screaming. "The palace hasn't been home in years. It's been a prison with nicer furniture." Lucien felt that truth sink in like a blade between his ribs. "Then where? Where do you want to go? Just tell me and I'll take you there. No arguments, no conditions. You want to disappear into the countryside and never see me again? I'll make it happen. You want to sail to the Southern Isles and start over? I'll buy you a ship. Just tell me what you need." "What I need," Celine said quietly, "is for you to understand that you can't fix this with grand gestures and dramatic rescues. You can't undo 7 years of being treated like an obstacle instead of a partner just because you finally realized what you lost." "I know. Do you?" "Because I have spent 7 years making myself smaller and quieter and more acceptable to a man who wanted a decoration instead of an equal. I have swallowed my pride and my anger and my grief every single time you chose your paranoia over my counsel. And the one time I stood up for myself, the one time I refused to apologize for trying to save the empire you were too stubborn to see was dying, you threw me out into a blizzard." Her voice was rising now, all that carefully controlled fury finally breaking free. "So don't you dare kneel in front of me now and act like some noble hero come to save his queen. You're not my savior, Lucien. You're the reason I needed saving in the first place." The words hit him like physical blows, each one true and devastating and completely deserved. Lucien had spent 10 days replaying their last argument, reading her journals, piecing together all the ways he'd failed her, but hearing it from her own mouth made it real in a way that solitary guilt never could. "You're right," he said finally, "about all of it. I was a coward and a tyrant, and I took you for granted because it was easier than facing my own failures. I can't undo that. I can't take back the things I said or the way I treated you. All I can do is promise that if you give me another chance, I will spend the rest of my life proving that I can be better." Celine looked at him for a long moment, and he saw the war happening behind her eyes. The part of her that still loved him fighting against the part that knew better than to trust promises from a man who'd broken everyone he'd ever made. Finally, she said, "Help me up. We can figure out the rest later." Lucien stood and offered his hand. She took it, her grip weak but determined, and let him pull her to her feet. She swayed immediately, her legs unable to support her weight after days of captivity, and Lucien caught her before she fell. "I can walk," she said. "I know you can, but you don't have to." He lifted her into his arms, and she was so light it terrified him. How long had they been starving her? How long had she been sitting in that frozen cell waiting for rescue or death, whichever came first? As he carried her out of the cell and down the tower stairs, Celine said quietly against his chest, "Malric set this up." "I know. I found your journals." "All of them?" "Every single page, including the ones about me being exactly like my father." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. And you were right." They emerged into the courtyard to find Vera organizing the surrender, disarming mercenaries and separating the ones who'd fought from the ones who'd given up immediately. Voss was still alive, barely, with 2 soldiers standing guard over him. The moment the mercenaries saw Celine, something shifted in the atmosphere. These were hard men who'd killed for money and followed orders without asking questions. But the sight of their battered queen being carried out of that tower by a king who looked ready to slaughter anyone who so much as breathed wrong hit different than any threat or payment ever could. One by one, they dropped to their knees in the snow. Not surrender. Something else. Something that looked almost like shame. Lucien ignored them and carried Celine to his horse. He wrapped her in his own cloak, thick fur that still held his body heat, and held her against him as Vera approached. "Orders, Your Majesty? Secure the prisoners. We'll deal with them when we get back to the capital. Anyone who resists gets a choice between chains and a shallow grave." "And Voss?" Lucien looked over at the dying commander. "He's got about an hour before he bleeds out. Leave him. Let the cold finish what my sword started." Vera nodded and moved to relay the orders. Celine stirred against Lucien's chest. "You're leaving him to freeze to death. He was going to execute you." "I know, but that doesn't make you less of a monster for doing it." The observation stung because it was true. Lucien had spent 20 years cultivating that monster, feeding it with violence and fear until it was the only thing he knew how to be. And here was Celine, half dead from torture and imprisonment, still trying to hold him accountable for his cruelty, still trying to save him from himself. "What would you have me do?" he asked quietly. "I'd have you be better than the men who hurt me. But I'm too tired to fight you about it right now." Lucien was quiet for a long moment, then he called out to Vera. "Captain, bind Voss's wounds and bring him as a prisoner. He stands trial when we return to the capital." Vera looked surprised but nodded. "Yes, sir." Celine's hand found his under the cloak and squeezed once. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even approval, but it was acknowledgement, and right now that was more than Lucien deserved. They rode out of the fortress as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of red and orange that made the frozen landscape look like a battlefield. Maybe it was. Maybe the whole empire was one giant battlefield now, scarred and bleeding and fighting to survive the winter. But as Lucien held Celine against him and felt her breathing steady into something almost like sleep, he allowed himself to hope that survival was possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. The ride back to the capital took 4 days instead of 3, because Lucien refused to push the pace when Celine was in no condition for hard travel. They stopped frequently, made camp in sheltered locations, and Vera's soldiers hunted for fresh game to supplement their rations. Celine slept most of the first 2 days, her body finally allowing itself to rest now that the immediate danger had passed. When she was awake, she didn't talk much, just watched the landscape roll by with eyes that had seen too much and processed too little. Lucien didn't push for conversation. He just stayed close, made sure she was warm and fed, and tried not to think about all the ways this fragile truce could shatter once they were back in the palace. On the 3rd night, camped in the ruins of an abandoned watchtower, Celine finally broke the silence. "What happened to Malric?" Lucien was sharpening his sword by the fire, a ritual that always helped him think. "Dead. I killed him in the throne room after he tried to stage a coup." Celine absorbed this without visible reaction. "And the nobles who supported him?" "In the dungeons, waiting for trial." "Trial." She almost smiled. "You're going to give them a trial. You told me to be better than the men who hurt you. Figured I'd start with due process." This time she did smile, just a little. "Who are you, and what have you done with the Alpha King?" "He's learning, slowly." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind howl outside their shelter. Finally, Celine said, "I read the reports while we were riding. The Empire's falling apart." "I know. House Corvain and House Brecken have declared independence. The Eastern Territories have closed their borders. 3 major cities are in open rebellion. We've lost almost a third of our territory in 2 weeks." "I know. And your plan is what exactly?" "Storm back into the capital, execute some traitors, and hope everyone else falls in line?" Lucien set down his sword and looked at her across the fire. "My plan is to do whatever you tell me to do. You were right about everything. The nobles, the trade routes, Malric's conspiracy. You saw what I was too blind to see. So if you say we negotiate with the rebels, we negotiate. If you say we make concessions to the Eastern Lords, we make concessions. If you say we dismantle the entire noble class and rebuild from scratch, I'll hand you the hammer." Celine studied him for a long moment. You understand that means giving up control, trusting my judgment even when it contradicts your instincts. I do. And you're ready for that? After 7 years of treating me like a threat instead of an ally? Lucienne held her gaze. No, I'm not ready. Trusting people doesn't come naturally to me, and trusting someone with power even less so. But I'm willing to try, because the alternative is watching this empire destroy itself while I'm too proud to ask for help. That's not the same as being ready. I know, but it's a start. Celine was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire with an expression Lucian couldn't read. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. Here's what's going to happen when we get back to the capital. You're going to stand in front of the entire court and publicly acknowledge every mistake you made, every wrong decision, every act of paranoia, every time you chose pride over reason. You're going to tell them that I am not just your queen, but your equal partner in ruling this empire. And then you're going to prove it by actually listening to my counsel instead of dismissing it the moment it contradicts what you want to hear. Lucian nodded slowly. And in return, Celine said, I'll help you save what's left of this dying empire. I'll negotiate with the rebels and the Eastern Lords and every other faction that's decided you're too dangerous to follow. I'll use every connection I built while you were busy playing tyrant to pull this kingdom back from the edge. But understand something, Lucian. This is the last chance. There is no third act, no dramatic redemption arc if you fall back into old patterns. You either change now, fundamentally and permanently, or I walk away and let you rule the ashes alone. The ultimatum hung in the air between them, absolute and non-negotiable. Lucian understood that he was standing on the edge of a cliff with two choices: step forward into uncertainty and potential growth, or fall backward into the comfortable patterns that had defined him for 20 years. Everything in his training, his upbringing, his father's brutal lessons about power and dominance screamed at him to reject her terms. Kings didn't make concessions. Kings didn't admit weakness. Kings didn't kneel before anyone, even their queens. But Lucian had watched that kind of kingship nearly destroy his empire in less than a month, had watched it drive away the one person capable of saving what he'd built, had watched it turn him into exactly the kind of tyrant his father had been, feared, hated, and ultimately alone. So he made a choice that would have killed his father to witness. He knelt in the dirt in front of Celine and said the words he'd never thought he'd say to anyone. I accept your terms. All of them. And I swear on whatever remains of my honor that I will spend the rest of my life earning the trust you're giving me now. Celine looked down at him with eyes that held equal parts hope and skepticism, love and wariness, forgiveness and the memory of every hurt he'd caused. Get up, Lucian. Kings don't kneel. Not even reformed ones. This one does. For you. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers cold but gentle against his scarred skin. Then do it where it matters. In front of the nobles who need to see it, in front of the people who've lost faith in both of us. Make your promises there where breaking them has consequences. Lucienne stood and pulled her close, and for the first time in weeks she didn't resist. They stood there in the firelight, two broken people trying to figure out how to rebuild what they'd both helped destroy, while outside the wind continued its assault and the empire continued its slow collapse toward chaos. They reached the capital on the fourth day to find the city transformed. Not physically. The buildings were the same, the walls still stood, the palace still dominated the skyline. But the atmosphere had changed in fundamental ways that made Lucien's skin crawl. The streets were empty except for soldiers. Every corner had guards watching for signs of rebellion. The markets that should have been crowded with vendors and citizens were shuttered and silent. And over it all hung the smell of smoke and fear and something rotten festering beneath the surface. This was what happened when a kingdom lost faith in its rulers. This was what happened when fear replaced loyalty as the primary mechanism of control. They rode through the silent streets toward the palace, and Lucienne felt the weight of every empty window, every citizen hiding behind locked doors, every life that had been made smaller and more desperate because of his failures. Celine must have felt it too, because she said quietly, "They're terrified. Of me. Of everything. The king they feared has become unstable. The queen they loved has disappeared. The nobles are fighting for power. The empire is collapsing. They don't know who to trust or what's coming next." Then we show them. Captain Vera was waiting at the palace gates with a full honor guard and an expression that suggested the last 4 days had been their own kind of hell. She dismounted as they approached and immediately dropped to one knee when she saw Celine. "Your Majesty, thank the gods you're alive." Celine managed a tired smile. "Good to see you too, Captain. How bad is it?" Vera stood and didn't sugarcoat. "3 more noble houses have declared against you while you were gone. 2 assassination attempts on the empty throne, both failed but close enough to be concerning. Riots in the lower city that we had to put down with force. And enough conspiracy theories about the Queen's disappearance to fill a library. So business as usual then. Worse, Your Majesty. Much worse. The people need to see you, need to know you're alive and unharmed. Otherwise the rumors will destroy what little stability we have left." Lucien helped Celine down from the horse, and she stood on shaky legs that were slowly remembering how to bear weight. She looked at the palace, at the guards watching with barely concealed hope, at the city beyond the walls that had once loved her. "Then let's give them a show." They entered the palace together, side by side, instead of Lucien leading and Celine following the way it had been for 7 years. The nobles who'd remained loyal were gathered in the throne room, along with the city's merchant council and religious leaders, and anyone else who'd managed to maintain influence during the chaos. The moment Lucien and Celine entered, the room went silent. Then someone started clapping. Then someone else. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, and Lucien realized with a start that they weren't clapping for him. They were clapping for Celine, for the queen they'd thought was dead, for the woman who'd held the empire together while their king had been busy tearing it apart. Celine stood there and let the applause wash over her, and Lucien saw the exact moment she made the decision to be what they needed her to be. She straightened despite the pain, lifted her chin despite the exhaustion, and became the queen who'd ruled beside him even when he hadn't deserved her. The applause finally died down, and every eye in the room turned to Lucien. This was the moment Celine had demanded, the public reckoning, the admission of failure in front of everyone who'd watched him rule with an iron fist for 20 years. Everything in his training screamed at him to deflect, to blame others, to maintain the image of infallible strength that had been beaten into him since childhood. But he'd made a promise in that frozen watchtower, and Lucien Draven was learning that some promises mattered more than pride. He stepped forward, and his voice carried to every corner of the throne room. "I owe this empire an apology and an explanation." The room was so quiet you could have heard snow falling. "For 7 years I have ruled with fear instead of wisdom. I have treated allies like enemies and counsel like threats. I have let my paranoia poison every decision, and my pride blind me to the truth that everyone else could see. And because of my failures, because I was too stubborn and too broken to accept help from the one person trying to save me from myself, I nearly destroyed everything we built." He could feel the shock rippling through the crowd. Kings didn't admit weakness. Kings didn't confess failures. Kings didn't stand in front of their subjects and acknowledge that they'd been wrong. But Lucien wasn't trying to be the kind of king his father had raised anymore. "Queen Celine is not just my wife. She is my equal partner in ruling this empire. And for 7 years I have treated her like a subordinate instead of recognizing that she possesses the very skills and wisdom that I lack. While I was busy threatening our allies and alienating our people, she was building the diplomatic networks that kept us from complete collapse. While I was consumed by paranoia, she was gathering evidence against real traitors. While I was playing tyrant, she was doing the actual work of governance." Lucien turned to look at Celine and found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I cannot undo the damage I've caused. I cannot give back the years I wasted or erase the hurt I inflicted. All I can do is promise that from this moment forward, Queen Celine's word carries the same weight as mine in all matters of state. Her decisions will not be questioned or undermined. Her counsel will not be dismissed or ignored, and anyone who treats her with anything less than the respect and authority she deserves will answer to me personally." He took a breath and delivered the final blow to his own ego. "I am stepping down from sole rule of this empire. Effective immediately, the Northern Empire will be governed by joint decree, myself and Queen Celine sharing equal power and equal responsibility. She will have full authority to negotiate with our enemies, make treaties, grant pardons, and do whatever else she deems necessary to save this dying kingdom from the mess I created." The throne room erupted. Nobles shouting questions and objections, merchants demanding clarification, everyone suddenly talking over each other in a chaos that would have sent the old Lucien into a rage. But he just stood there and let them rage, because this was the consequence of change. This was what happened when you shattered traditions that had held for centuries. And if they couldn't handle a king admitting weakness and sharing power, then they'd never survive what was coming next. Celine stepped forward and her voice cut through the noise like a blade. Enough. The room went silent again. I understand that this is unprecedented. I understand that many of you have concerns about stability and tradition and whether this empire can survive such a fundamental shift in how it's governed. But understand this. The old way of ruling nearly destroyed us. King Lucien's admission today took more courage than any battle he's ever fought. And if you cannot see the strength in a leader willing to acknowledge his failures and change course, then you're exactly the kind of advisor this empire needs to leave behind. She paused, and Lucien watched her transform fully into the queen he'd always known she could be. The rebellions will be dealt with through negotiation, not slaughter. The noble houses who declared against us will be given one chance to return to the fold before we strip them of lands and titles. The Eastern Territories will receive the trade concessions I've been trying to implement for 3 years. And anyone in this room who has been profiting from corruption or embezzlement or any other betrayal of the people's trust will confess now or be exposed later. Your choice. The threat hung in the air, and Lucien saw several nobles go pale. We have 10 days, Celine continued, to stabilize this empire before winter kills what civil war started. 10 days to prove that we can govern with wisdom instead of fear. 10 days to earn back the trust we've lost. And I promise you this, anyone who stands with us, who works toward unity instead of division, will be rewarded. But anyone who continues to play political games while our people starve will be removed from power so completely that history will forget they ever existed. She turned to Lucien, and something passed between them that felt almost like partnership. This empire will survive, she said, but only if we're willing to do the hard work of rebuilding it from the ground up. Only if we're willing to be better than we've been. And only if we remember that crowns don't make us strong. The people we serve do. The speech ended and the throne room remained silent, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. The complete transformation of how the Northern Empire would be governed. The public dismantling of the Alpha King's absolute authority. The rise of a queen who'd been dismissed and underestimated and nearly killed for trying to save the kingdom from itself. Finally, an old lord in the back called out, "And what guarantee do we have that this partnership will work? That you won't fall back into old patterns the moment the crisis passes?" Celine looked at Lucien, and he knew what she needed him to say. "There are no guarantees," he said. "All I can offer is my word that I will honor the commitments I made today. And if I fail, if I break those promises or revert to the tyrant I was, then Queen Celine has my full support to remove me from power by whatever means necessary." The gasps that followed were deeply satisfying in their horror. He'd just given Celine permission to depose him. He'd just made himself vulnerable in a way that kings never allowed. He'd just proven that he meant every word of his reformation, even if it cost him everything. Celine's hand found his, and she squeezed once. Then she addressed the room one final time. "We start rebuilding tomorrow. Tonight, we mourn what we've lost and prepare for what comes next." Dismissed. The nobles filed out slowly, still processing the earthquake that had just reshaped their political landscape. Soon it was just Lucien and Celine and a handful of guards in the vast throne room. Celine swayed slightly, the exhaustion and pain she'd been holding back finally breaking through her queenly composure. Lucien caught her before she fell. "Bed," he said, "now." She didn't argue, just let him carry her through the palace halls to their chambers. The same chambers she'd walked out of 2 weeks ago when he'd called her a traitor. The same chambers that had been more prison than home for longer than either of them wanted to acknowledge. But when Lucien laid her on the bed and started to leave, she caught his hand. "Stay." He stayed. They lay there in the darkness, not speaking, just breathing the same air and trying to figure out how two people who'd hurt each other so deeply could possibly build something worth saving. Finally, Celine said, "This doesn't mean I've forgiven you." "I know. And it doesn't mean everything's fixed between us. I know that too. But it's a start. Yeah, it's a start." She was quiet for a long moment, then said the thing that had been hanging between them since he'd found her in that frozen cell. "I'm not sure I can ever fully trust you again, Lucien. You broke something fundamental when you threw me out into that storm, and I don't know if it can be repaired." The honesty gutted him, but he forced himself to stay present with the pain instead of deflecting it. Then I'll spend however long it takes proving that I can be trusted, even if it's decades, even if you never fully believe it, because you deserve that effort, and I deserve the struggle of earning back what I destroyed." Celine turned to look at him in the darkness, and he saw tears on her face for the first time since he'd found her. "I loved you so much," she whispered. "I loved you enough to forgive every mistake, every cruel word, every time you chose fear over me, and you threw it away like it meant nothing. I know, and I will regret that for the rest of my life." "Good." She wiped her eyes roughly. "Because you should. You should carry that regret every single day and let it remind you what happens when you take people for granted." They fell silent again, and Lucien felt the full weight of what he'd done settling into his bones like a sickness that would never fully heal. But as he lay there beside the woman he'd nearly destroyed, holding her hand in the darkness while their empire teetered on the edge of collapse, Lucien made a final promise to himself. He would be better. Not perfect, not immediately transformed, but better than he'd been. Better than his father, better than every instinct that screamed at him to dominate and control and never show weakness. He would earn back Celine's trust, even if it took the rest of his life. He would rebuild their empire into something worth ruling. He would prove that even the most broken people could change if they wanted it badly enough. And if he failed, if the weight of his past proved too heavy or the empire collapsed despite their best efforts, or Celine decided he wasn't worth the struggle, then at least he'd go down fighting for something that mattered instead of dying alone on a throne built from fear and blood. Outside, the winter storm continued its assault on the capital. But inside the palace, in a room where two people were trying to figure out how to love each other again, something fragile and cautiously hopeful began to take root. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't happily ever after. It was just two damaged people choosing to try one more time, despite every reason not to, despite knowing how badly it could end, despite the certainty that the road ahead would be brutal and unforgiving and lined with the consequences of every failure that had brought them to this moment. But sometimes trying was enough. Sometimes the choice to keep fighting, keep growing, keep pushing towards something better was all you had. And as Lucien fell asleep holding the woman he'd almost killed, the woman who still hadn't decided if he was worth saving, he clung to that fragile maybe like a drowning man clings to driftwood in a storm. Because maybe was better than nothing. Maybe was a chance. And for a man who'd burned every other chance he'd ever been given, maybe was a goddamn miracle worth dying for. The first 3 days of their joint rule went better than Lucien had any right to expect. Celine threw herself into negotiations with the rebel houses with a ferocity that would have impressed him if he hadn't been so terrified she'd collapse from exhaustion. Her ribs were still healing, her hands still shook when she thought no one was looking. But she sat in those meeting rooms for 12 hours straight and dismantled every argument the nobles threw at her with surgical precision. House Corvain agreed to return to the fold in exchange for reduced tax obligations and a seat on the newly formed Trade Council. House Brecken took longer to convince, but Celine found leverage in shipping contracts they'd been violating for years and used it to extract concessions that actually benefited the empire instead of just the noble families. Lucien watched her work and understood with devastating clarity how badly he'd wasted her talents for 7 years. He focused on what he knew best: military reorganization and rooting out the remaining conspirators from Malric's network. It turned out the advisor had been far more ambitious than even Celine's journals had suggested. He'd infiltrated the palace guard, bribed half the merchant council, and planted agents in every major city from the capital to the eastern borders. Cleaning out that rot required methods Lucien was very good at. Methods that involved dungeons and interrogations and the kind of fear that made men confess to crimes their grandmothers had committed just to make the questions stop. But he was careful. Checked every accusation with Celine before acting on it. Let her review the evidence, question the prisoners herself, decide which threats were real and which were just desperate people saying whatever they thought would save them. It was exhausting, sharing power. Having to justify every decision, explain every instinct, wait for approval before acting on intelligence that his gut said was solid. A dozen times a day he wanted to just give orders and expect them to be followed without debate. But he'd made a promise. And Lucien was discovering that keeping promises was harder than any battle he'd ever fought. On the fourth morning, everything started falling apart. Lucien was in the war room reviewing troop deployments with Captain Vera when one of the palace messengers burst in without knocking, The kid was maybe 17, green enough that protocol still mattered to him, which meant whatever had just happened was bad enough to override years of training. "Your Majesty," the messenger gasped. "The Eastern Trade Convoy, the one Queen Celine negotiated. It was attacked." Lucien was on his feet before the sentence finished. "Where?" 3 miles outside the capital, on the northern road. "Casualties?" 12 dead, maybe more. "The survivors are being brought to the palace now." Lucien grabbed his sword and was moving before Vera could ask for orders. She followed anyway, already shouting commands to mobilize the guard. They hit the courtyard at a run and found chaos waiting for them. Wounded merchants being carried on stretchers, their blood staining the fresh snow. Overturned wagons with arrows still embedded in the wooden sides. And in the center of it all, a pile of bodies arranged in a way that made Lucien's stomach turn. They'd been executed. Lined up and killed systematically, each one shot through the heart at close range. Professional work, military precision. And pinned to the chest of the closest corpse was a note written in handwriting Lucien recognized from 1,000 military reports. Commander Aldrich Voss, the same commander they'd captured at the northern fortress. The same commander who was supposed to be locked in the palace dungeons awaiting trial. Lucien tore the note free and read it while his blood turned to ice. To the false king and his whore queen. "You thought capturing me would end this. You thought Malric's death meant the game was over. You were wrong. We are Legion, and we will not stop until your corrupt empire burns to ash and the true rulers of the North take their rightful place. Every convoy you send will be slaughtered. Every ally you make will be murdered. Every step toward peace will be paid for in blood. You cannot negotiate with revolution. You cannot reform what needs to be destroyed. Winter is coming for you both, and this time there will be no rescue." Lucien crushed the note in his fist and turned to Vera. "Voss, where is he?" The captain's face went white. "The dungeons, sir. He should be—" "Now!" Lucien snarled, and they were running again, this time toward the palace undercroft, where they kept prisoners who were too dangerous or too valuable to house in the regular cells. The dungeon guard was dead at his post, his throat cut so cleanly he'd probably never seen the blade coming. The keys were missing from his belt, and when they reached Voss's cell, the door was standing open and the commander was gone. "How?" Lucien said very quietly. "How did a prisoner under maximum security escape from the most fortified building in the Empire?" No one had an answer. Lucien grabbed the nearest guard by the throat and slammed him against the stone wall hard enough to crack mortar. Who else was on duty last night? The guard was choking, his face turning purple, but he managed to gasp out 3 names. Lucien recognized all of them. Veteran soldiers, men who'd served the crown for decades. Men who'd apparently decided that decades of loyalty meant nothing compared to whatever Voss's people were paying. He dropped the guard and addressed Vera. "Find those 3 soldiers. Alive if possible, dead if necessary. Then triple the watch on every entrance to this palace and start vetting every single member of the guard for connections to Malric's network. Sir, that's going to take weeks, and we don't have—" "Then work faster!" Lucien roared, and the entire dungeon seemed to shake with it. "Because if we can't trust our own guards, if traitors can walk in and out of this palace whenever they please, then we're already dead and just too stupid to know it yet." He stormed out of the dungeons and went looking for Celine. Found her in the council chamber still negotiating with the Eastern lords, her face carefully composed, even though he could see the tension in her shoulders from across the room. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression made her stand immediately. "Excuse me, gentlemen. We'll resume in an hour." The lords filed out looking uncertain, and the moment the door closed, Celine crossed to Lucien. "What happened?" "The convoy was attacked. 12 dead, maybe more. Voss escaped from the dungeons and left us a love letter promising to slaughter everyone we make peace with." He handed her the note and watched the color drain from her face as she read it. "This can't be happening," she said quietly. "We were so careful. Every guard was vetted, every prisoner accounted for. How did he—" "Inside help. Has to be. Someone with access to the dungeons, someone the guards would trust enough to let their defenses down." Celine looked up sharply. "You think there's another conspiracy, another network we haven't uncovered? I think Malric was just one head of a hydra that's been growing in this empire for years. And every time we cut off one head, 2 more take its place." The observation hung between them, devastating in its implications. They'd thought capturing Malric's inner circle would be enough, thought executing the traitor and imprisoning his supporters would send a message that rebellion wouldn't be tolerated. But Voss's escape and the convoy massacre proved something far worse. The rot went deeper than either of them had imagined, deeper than corruption or simple ambition. This was organized revolution, patient and methodical and willing to play the long game. And somewhere in the palace, maybe in that very room where they stood, someone was feeding information to the enemy and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Celine moved to the window overlooking the courtyard where the bodies were still being moved. We can't negotiate peace if every ally we make becomes a target. The Eastern Lords will withdraw the moment they hear about this. House Corvain and House Brecken will use it as proof that we can't protect them. Everything we've built in the last 4 days will collapse. Not if we find Voss first. Celine turned to look at him, and he saw the same calculation happening behind her eyes that was happening in his own mind. They were thinking like partners now, reading each other's strategies without needing words. "You want to hunt him," she said. "I want to end this, permanently. No more trials, no more prisoners, no more chances for escape. We find Voss and everyone connected to him, and we burn that network to the ground so completely that no one ever thinks about rebellion again. That's the old way, Lucy. And the tyrant's way. We agreed to reform. To be better than... I know what we agreed. But reform doesn't mean suicide. And if we let Voss keep operating, if we let this revolution gain momentum, there won't be an empire left to reform." Celine was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the courtyard where the snow was slowly covering the bloodstains. When she spoke, her voice was tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. "You're right. We can't negotiate with people who want us dead. But we also can't return to ruling by fear and slaughter. There has to be a middle path. Then help me find it. Because right now, all I can see is enemies everywhere, and no way to tell friend from foe until they put a knife in our backs." They spent the next hour working through options, testing strategies, trying to find an approach that would neutralize the threat without completely abandoning the reforms they'd promised. It was brutal work, full of compromises that satisfied neither of them, and decisions that felt like betrayals of everything they'd said they stood for. But that's what ruling was. Not grand gestures and inspiring speeches, but the grinding daily work of choosing between bad options and worse ones while trying to keep people alive long enough to find better solutions. By the time the Eastern Lords returned for their meeting, Lucien and Celine had a plan. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the best they had. The next 2 days were a masterclass in controlled paranoia. Every guard in the palace was interviewed, every servant questioned, every noble who'd had contact with Malric's network placed under surveillance. Lucien pulled soldiers from the city watch and border patrols to reinforce palace security, creating layers of protection so redundant that no one could move through the building without being seen by at least 3 separate checkpoints. Celine worked the political angle, using her network of merchants and minor nobles to spread rumors that Voss had fled the capital entirely. False information designed to make the enemy think they'd won, that the investigation had gone cold, that it was safe to resume operations. It was a trap, and all they could do was wait for someone to walk into it. On the 6th day, someone did. Captain Vera found Lucien in the training yard where he'd been working through sword forms to burn off the tension that came with waiting. She approached with an expression that managed to be both triumphant and deeply disturbed. "We caught one," she said without preamble. "Young soldier named Marcus Thorne. Related to Malric somehow, third cousin or something. He was trying to leave the city with documents detailing troop movements and guard rotations." "Where is he?" "Interrogation room. Waiting for you." Lucien cleaned his blade and followed Vera into the palace undercroft. The interrogation rooms were designed to break people, windowless, cold enough to hurt, with stone walls that made every sound echo until prisoners couldn't tell their own screams from their imagination. Marcus Thorne was maybe 25, still young enough to think loyalty to a cause mattered more than survival. He looked up when Lucien entered, and there was defiance in his eyes that wouldn't last past the first real question. Lucien sat down across from him and studied the young soldier for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You have one chance to walk out of here alive. Tell me where Voss is hiding." Marcus laughed. It was a brittle, desperate sound. "You think I'm afraid of you? You're finished, old man. The empire is crumbling, and you're too blind to see it. Voss is just the beginning. By spring, there will be nothing left of your corrupt dynasty but ashes and..." Lucian moved faster than the kid could process. 1 second he was sitting calmly across the table. The next his hand was wrapped around Marcus's throat, and the soldier was being lifted out of his chair. "Let me be very clear," Lucian said, his voice deadly calm. "I have spent the last week trying to be the better man my queen believes I can be. I have negotiated instead of executed. I have shown mercy instead of strength. I have compromised my every instinct in service of building something worth ruling. But right now, with 12 innocent merchants dead and a traitor loose in my city threatening everyone I've sworn to protect, I am very close to reverting to the monster I used to be." He tightened his grip until Marcus's face turned purple. "So I'll ask one more time, and if you give me anything other than complete honesty, I will make you beg for the mercy of a quick death." "Where is Voss?" Marcus tried to spit in his face, but couldn't generate enough saliva through the choking. Lucian slammed him against the wall and felt something crack. Wrong answer. What happened next would haunt Lucian for weeks. Not because of what he did, he'd done far worse during his years of conquest, but because of how easily he slipped back into old patterns. How natural it felt to use pain and fear as tools. How satisfying it was to watch defiance crumble into terror. By the time he was done, Marcus had given up everything. The safe house where Voss was hiding. The names of 12 other conspirators still operating inside the palace. The supply routes they were using to smuggle weapons into the city. The date they'd chosen for their final assault on the throne. 3 days from now. During the winter festival, when half the city would be drunk and the other half would be too cold to care what happened in the palace. Lucien left Marcus bleeding on the interrogation room floor and found Celine waiting in the corridor outside. She took one look at his face, at the blood on his hands, and her expression shifted into something he couldn't quite read. "You got what you needed," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. At what cost?" He looked at her and saw the question behind the question. Had he broken his promise? Had he reverted to the tyrant he'd sworn to leave behind? Had the last week of partnership and reform been nothing but performance, abandoned the moment real pressure returned? "I did what had to be done," Lucien said. "And I'd do it again to protect this empire." Celine's jaw tightened. "We agreed. No more torture, no more ruling through fear. We agreed to a lot of things before 12 people got slaughtered for the crime of believing in peace. Before a prisoner escaped from maximum security because someone we trusted decided revolution was more important than loyalty. Before we found out there's an army of traitors still hiding in this palace waiting for their chance to kill us both. So your solution is to become exactly what they accuse you of being? My solution is to survive long enough to implement the reforms you want. But I can't reform a corpse, Celine, and neither can you." The argument died there because they both knew he was right, and they both hated it. This was the impossible balance they'd committed to, trying to be better while operating in a system that punished any sign of weakness, trying to rule with wisdom while surrounded by people who only understood violence. It was a knife edge they were walking, and one wrong step would send them plummeting back into the darkness they'd barely escaped. "What did you learn?" Celine asked finally. Lucien told her everything. The safe house, the conspirators, the planned assault. With each detail, her expression grew darker, the weight of their situation settling into her bones, the same way it had settled into his. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We move on the safe house tonight. Full force, no warning, no quarter given. And tomorrow we arrest every conspirator Marcus named before they have a chance to warn Voss." "That's not reform," Lucien said carefully. "That's execution without trial." "I know. But if we wait, if we try to do this the right way, they'll scatter and we'll be right back where we started. Sometimes the only way to build something better is to completely destroy what came before." Lucien stared at her, seeing his own darkness reflected in her eyes. This was what survival did to people. Ground them down until the lines between right and wrong blurred into gray, until the only clear truth left was the necessity of staying alive long enough to make tomorrow slightly better than today. "Together," he said. Celine nodded. "Together." They moved on the safe house 3 hours past midnight with 40 soldiers and no illusions about how ugly this was going to get. The building was an abandoned warehouse near the docks, chosen specifically because it was far enough from residential areas that screaming wouldn't attract attention. Lucien took point with Vera and her best fighters, while Celine coordinated the perimeter to ensure no one escaped. They breached the main entrance simultaneously with two side doors, flooding the warehouse with armed soldiers before the occupants could mount a defense. The fight was brutal and brief. Voss's people were trained and ready, but they'd been caught sleeping, literally, and that cost them the initiative. Within 5 minutes, the warehouse was secured and the surviving conspirators were being dragged outside in chains. Voss himself was in the back room, standing over a map of the palace with attack routes marked in red. He looked up when Lucian entered and smiled like they were old friends meeting for drinks. "Took you longer than I expected," the commander said. "I was starting to think you'd gone soft." Lucian didn't answer, just crossed the room and drove his fist into Voss's face hard enough to shatter bone. The commander went down hard, blood pouring from his ruined nose, and Lucian was on him before he could recover. This time, there would be no capture, no trial, no chance for escape. This time, Lucian would finish what he should have finished at the northern fortress. He reached for his blade and Voss laughed through the blood. "Go ahead. Prove you're still the monster everyone fears. Prove that all your talk of reform was just lies to keep your pretty queen happy." Lucian's hand froze on the sword hilt, because Voss was right. Every instinct screamed at him to kill this man, to eliminate the threat permanently and completely. That's what the old Lucien would have done. That's what his father would have demanded. That's what 20 years of ruling through fear had taught him was the only reliable solution. But he'd promised Celine he'd be better, had promised himself he'd break the cycle of violence that had defined his reign, had promised the Empire that reform meant something more than just words. Captain Vera appeared in the doorway. "Sir?" "Orders?" Lucien stood slowly, his hand leaving the sword undrawn. "Chain him. Heavy shackles, triple guard, no contact with anyone except me and the Queen. And this time he stays in a cell that's been stripped to bare stone with guards, who've been vetted so thoroughly we know what they had for breakfast 10 years ago." Voss was still laughing as they dragged him away. "You can't help yourself, can you? Can't quite commit to being the hero or the villain. You're stuck in between, trying to be both, and it's going to destroy you." The observation cut deeper than Lucian wanted to admit. Outside, Celine was overseeing the prisoner transport with an efficiency that would have impressed a general. She looked up when Lucien emerged, and he saw the question in her eyes. "Alive," he said. "For trial." Something in her expression shifted. Relief, maybe, or approval. Hard to tell in the darkness. "Good," she said quietly. "That's good." They rode back to the palace in silence, both of them processing what they'd just done and what it meant. They'd crushed a conspiracy, captured their enemy, and done it without completely abandoning the principles they'd committed to. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like surviving one more day in a war that had no end in sight. The arrest started at dawn. Every name Marcus had given them, every conspirator identified through Voss's documents, every person even tangentially connected to Malric's network. Lucien and Celine had spent what remained of the night reviewing evidence and building cases strong enough that even the most sympathetic nobles couldn't deny the treason. By noon, the dungeons were overflowing with prisoners awaiting trial. By sunset, 3 of them were dead. Suicide, the guards claimed. Prisoners who'd used hidden blades or makeshift nooses to escape justice before it could be served. But Lucien had seen enough political murders disguised as suicide to know the truth. Someone was cleaning house, eliminating witnesses before they could testify, which meant the conspiracy was even deeper than they'd realized. Deeper and more organized and willing to sacrifice its own people to protect whoever was really running this operation. Lucien called an emergency council meeting and stood in front of the assembled nobles with Celine at his side. Every face in that room was suspect. Every expression of concern could be hiding betrayal. Every promise of loyalty could be lies waiting for the right moment to detonate. This was what paranoia felt like when it was justified. "We have a traitor in this room, Lucien said without preamble. "Someone feeding information to our enemies. Someone who helped Voss escape. Someone who just murdered 3 prisoners to keep them from revealing the full scope of this conspiracy." The nobles erupted in outrage and denials, each one louder than the last, each one performing innocence with practiced precision. Celine's voice cut through the noise. "Enough." The room went silent. "Tomorrow morning," she continued, "every person in this palace will submit to questioning under oath. Every transaction you've made in the last year will be audited. Every communication you've sent or received will be examined, and anyone who refuses will be arrested on suspicion of treason." "You can't do that," Lord Heron protested. "We have rights, protections under—" "You have nothing," Lucian said quietly, "except what we allow you to keep. And right now, with bodies piling up and enemies inside our walls, we're not feeling particularly generous about protecting the rights of potential traitors. This is tyranny. This is survival." The meeting dissolved into chaos after that, nobles shouting accusations at each other, old rivalries surfacing under the pressure, the entire room fracturing into factions that no amount of authority could control. Lucien watched it happen and felt the last threads of order snapping one by one. This was how empires died. Not in glorious battles or dramatic rebellions, but in conference rooms where trust corroded into suspicion and cooperation decayed into paranoia until the whole structure collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction. And somewhere in that room, hidden behind a mask of concern or outrage or fear, the real enemy was watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came 3 hours later. Lucien was in his study reviewing guard rotations when the door burst open and Vera stumbled in, her armor scorched and her face streaked with soot and blood. "Fire!" she gasped. "In the dungeons. Someone set fire to the entire cell block." Lucien was moving before she finished the sentence, running through the palace corridors toward the Undercroft with Vera right behind him. They could smell the smoke before they saw it, thick and black and carrying the distinctive stench of burning flesh. The dungeon entrance was an inferno. Guards were trying to fight it with buckets of water, but the fire was too hot, too well fed, spreading faster than any natural blaze should. Someone had used accelerant, oil or pitch or something designed to burn so hot that stone itself started to crack. And inside, trapped behind walls of flame, were 50 prisoners, including Voss and everyone else who might have information about the conspiracy. "Get water!" Lucien roared. "Get every bucket, every barrel, every goddamn person who can carry liquid and—" "It's too late," Vera said. "The heat's too intense. Anyone still alive in there will be dead from smoke before we can reach them." Lucien watched his last chance at uncovering the full conspiracy burn to ash in front of him and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. This wasn't random chaos. This was strategy. Someone had orchestrated this perfectly, using their attempts at reform against them, turning mercy into weakness, patience into vulnerability. Someone who understood exactly how Lucien and Celine thought and could predict their every move. Someone close enough to access the dungeons unquestioned. Someone they trusted. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Where's Celine?" he demanded. Vera's face went pale. "Last I saw, she was in the council chamber finishing—" Lucien ran. He sprinted through the palace halls with a certainty born from 20 years of combat instinct screaming that something was wrong, took the stairs 3 at a time, burst through the council chamber doors hard enough to tear them off their hinges, and found Celine on the floor in a spreading pool of blood, with Captain Vera standing over her holding a knife. Except it wasn't Vera. Couldn't be Vera because Vera was behind him in the dungeon corridor, which meant the woman he'd been talking to, the woman he'd trusted with coordination and security for the last week, had been someone else. An imposter. A plant. A traitor so deep in their organization that she'd been able to replace the captain of the guard without anyone noticing. The false Vera smiled at him. It was Voss's smile. That same arrogant certainty that they'd already won. "Took you long enough?" she said, in a voice that wasn't Vera's at all. "We were starting to think you'd let her bleed out before you figured it out." Lucien drew his sword and everything else ceased to matter. The fire, the conspiracy, the empire itself, all of it reduced to the singular focus of crossing the space between him and the woman who'd just stabbed his queen. He moved like lightning, and she met him with a blade that should have been too skilled for any infiltrator. They came together in a clash that shattered furniture and sent documents flying, trading strikes with a speed and precision that spoke of years of training. But Lucien had rage on his side, the pure, unfiltered fury of a man who'd spent 2 weeks learning to be better, only to have it thrown back in his face by someone who'd been playing them from the start. He drove her back step by step, overwhelming her defense through sheer aggression, until her back hit the wall and she had nowhere left to retreat. "Who are you?" he snarled. The woman's face rippled and changed, some kind of illusion magic dissolving to reveal someone Lucien didn't recognize. Pale skin, dark eyes, Features so average they'd disappear in any crowd. Does it matter? She asked. We're everywhere. In every guard unit, every noble house, every layer of your precious empire. You can't stop what's coming. Watch me. He drove his blade through her chest and felt the resistance of flesh and bone giving way. She died with that smile still on her face, died knowing she'd accomplished her mission, died leaving them with more questions than answers. Lucienne let her body drop and turned to Celine. She was still breathing, but barely, her hand pressed against the wound in her side where blood was pulsing between her fingers. Her eyes found his, and he saw fear there for the first time since he'd known her. Not fear of dying, fear that he'd revert, fear that losing her would break whatever fragile reformation he'd managed, fear that her death would unleash the monster he'd been trying so hard to cage. Don't, she whispered. Don't let this destroy you. Lucien dropped to his knees beside her and pressed his hands over the wound, trying to slow the bleeding even though he could feel her life draining away beneath his palms. You're not dying, he said. You hear me? You don't get to leave me. Not after everything we've survived. Not after I finally learned how to deserve you. Celine's laugh was wet and broken. Always so dramatic. Stay with me. Trying. Her eyes started to close and Lucien shouted for help, for physicians, for anyone who could save her. His voice echoed through the empty council chamber, and he realized with dawning horror that they were alone. The real Vera was fighting the fire. The guards were dealing with the dungeon. The nobles had scattered after the meeting. And whoever had orchestrated this had timed it perfectly to ensure that no help would come in time. Lucienne looked down at Celine and felt 20 years of carefully constructed walls crumbling into dust. She was dying in his arms because he'd failed to protect her, because his attempts at reform had made them vulnerable, because someone had exploited every ounce of mercy they'd shown and turned it into a weapon against them. This was his fault, all of it. The fire, the infiltration, the knife in Celine's side. Every failure cascading together into this single devastating moment where everything he'd tried to build collapsed around him. And somewhere in the burning palace, the real enemies were watching and laughing at the stupid king who'd thought love and partnership could fix what violence and fear had broken. Celine's hand found his face, her fingers cold against his skin. Promise me, she whispered. Anything. Promise you won't become him again. Your father. The tyrant. Promise you'll stay. The man you were trying to be. Lucien wanted to promise, wanted to tell her he'd honor her wishes and continue their work and prove that people could change even when the world punished them for trying. But looking at her blood on his hands, feeling her life slipping away while their empire burned around them, Lucien couldn't find those words, because he knew with absolute certainty what he was going to do the moment she stopped breathing. He was going to become exactly what she feared, was going to unleash every ounce of rage and violence he'd been suppressing in service of reform, was going to hunt down every single person connected to this conspiracy and make them suffer in ways that would echo through history as a warning to anyone who ever thought about threatening what he loved. He was going to become his father's son after all. And Celine, dying in his arms, could see that transformation already beginning behind his eyes. No, she breathed. Lucien, no. Don't let them win. Don't let them turn you back into... Her words cut off as the wound pulsed fresh blood and her breathing went shallow and rapid. Shock was setting in, her body shutting down system by system as blood loss took its toll. Lucien held her tighter and felt something inside him shatter completely. This was the moment, the point of no return. Either he honored Celine's dying wish and continued trying to be better even as his world fell apart, or he embraced the darkness that had always been waiting just beneath the surface and became the monster that empires actually needed to survive. Either he chose love over revenge, partnership over power, reform over retribution, or he chose to win at any cost and accept the man that choice would turn him into. Celine's eyes were closing now, her hand falling away from his face. And Lucien Draven, Alpha King of the Northern Empire, made his choice. Lucien screamed for the palace physician with a voice that tore his throat raw and carried through the burning corridors like a war cry. He pressed both hands harder against Celine's wound, feeling her blood pulse hot and rhythmic between his fingers, feeling her life trying to escape despite everything he did to hold it inside. She was still breathing, shallow and ragged, but breathing. That meant there was still time. The physician burst through the door moments later with two apprentices carrying supplies, their faces pale with smoke and fear. They took one look at the scene and immediately began working, pushing Lucien aside with professional efficiency that he would have killed them for under any other circumstance. "How bad?" Lucien demanded. The physician didn't answer, just cut away Celine's blood-soaked tunic and exposed the wound. It was deep, angled upward beneath her ribs, the kind of strike designed to puncture organs and cause maximum internal damage. Professional work. Assassin work. Lucien watched them pack the wound and felt something cold and final settling into his bones. This wasn't random violence. This was a message. A demonstration of how completely their enemies had infiltrated the palace, how easily they could reach the people Lucien loved, how powerless his attempts at reform had made him. Someone had planned this down to the smallest detail, had replaced Vera with a perfect imposter, had orchestrated the dungeon fire as a distraction, had waited until Lucien and Celine were most vulnerable and then struck with surgical precision. Someone who knew them intimately, knew their routines, their security protocols, their weaknesses. Someone still inside the palace. The real Captain Vera appeared in the doorway, her face blackened with soot and her eyes widening at the carnage in the council chamber. She started to speak, but Lucien cut her off. "Lock down the palace, no one in or out. Every entrance sealed, every corridor guarded, every single person accounted for." "Sir, the fire in the dungeons is still... I don't care if the entire palace burns to the ground. Lock it down now." Vera nodded and disappeared. Lucien turned back to the physician, who was working with the kind of focused intensity that meant things were very bad. "Can you save her?" The physician's hands never stopped moving. "If we can stop the internal bleeding and prevent infection, but she's lost a lot of blood. The next few hours will determine whether she survives. Then make sure she survives." "I'm doing everything I can, Your Majesty. Do more." Lucien stood and crossed to where the false Vera's body lay in a spreading pool of blood. He knelt and began searching her, ignoring the smell of death and smoke, looking for anything that might identify who she was working for. He found 3 things. A tattoo on her inner wrist showing a symbol he didn't recognize. 3 triangles interlocked in a pattern that suggested old magic or older conspiracies. A vial of clear liquid tucked in a hidden pocket of her uniform that smelled like the accelerant used in the dungeon fire. And a single piece of parchment with 7 names written in code so simple that Lucien translated it in seconds. 7 names. 7 nobles who'd been at the council meeting earlier. 7 people who were either conspirators or targets, and Lucien had no way of knowing which without interrogating them all. But one name on that list made his blood freeze. Lord Heron, his master of spies. The man who'd brought him Celine's journal. The man who'd been feeding him intelligence about Malric's network for months. The man who'd had access to everything. Lucien stood slowly and felt the pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. Heron had been the leak from the beginning, had been feeding information to the conspirators while pretending to root them out, had probably helped Malric orchestrate the original coup attempt, had survived this long by being exactly useful enough that Lucien never questioned his loyalty. And now he was somewhere in this palace waiting for news that both the king and queen were dead so he could step in and claim power in the chaos. The rage that filled Lucien then was beyond anything he'd felt before, beyond the fury that had carried him through battles and conquests, beyond the grief that had driven him into the frozen north searching for Celine. This was something colder and more focused. The rage of a man who'd tried to be better and been punished for it. The rage of a king who'd shown mercy and watched it exploited. The rage of someone who'd finally learned what he had to lose and was watching it slip away despite every promise he'd made. This was the rage that had built empires, and it was about to tear one apart. "Your Majesty," the physician said quietly, "we need to move her. She requires surgery and I can't do it here." Lucien looked at Celine's pale face and made a decision that would define everything that came after. "Take her to the royal chambers. Post guards at every entrance. Soldiers you've personally vetted, no one else. If anyone tries to enter that room without my explicit permission, kill them. No questions, no exceptions, no mercy." He turned to one of the apprentices. "Find Captain Vera. Tell her to bring me Lord Heron, alive if possible, in pieces if necessary." The apprentice ran. Lucien watched them carry Celine away and felt something fundamental shift inside him. For 2 weeks, he'd been trying to balance reform with survival, mercy with strength, the man Celine wanted him to be with the man the Empire actually needed. That balance had just shattered, because the truth was simpler and uglier than all his attempts at reformation. The truth was that empires didn't survive on hope and partnership and noble intentions. They survived on fear and blood, and the absolute certainty that threatening the crown meant death so complete and terrible that no one would dare try it twice. His father had understood that, had built a kingdom on the bones of everyone who'd opposed him and ruled for 30 years without a single successful rebellion. Lucien had spent 20 years trying to be different, and all it had gotten him was a dying wife and a palace full of traitors. So he was done trying to be different, done trying to be better, done pretending that you could fix a rotten system by being the bigger person. If the Empire wanted a monster, he'd give them one they'd never forget. He left the council chamber and walked through the smoke-filled corridors with purpose that made guards scramble out of his way. The palace was chaos, soldiers fighting the dungeon fire, servants evacuating valuable documents, nobles screaming questions that no one had answers for. Lucien ignored all of it. He went to the armory and selected weapons the way other men selected wine. A sword that had tasted blood in 100 battles, knives designed for close work and dirty fighting, and his father's old warhammer, the one he'd sworn never to touch because it represented everything brutal and unforgiving about the previous regime. He lifted it now and felt its weight settle into his hands like coming home. Then he went hunting. The first person he found was a minor noble named Cassian Drake, who'd been at the council meeting and whose name had appeared on the coded list. Lucien cornered him in the east wing, trying to flee through a servant's passage. The noble saw him coming and immediately started babbling excuses and explanations. But Lucien wasn't interested in conversation. He grabbed Cassian by the throat and slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack stone. "Who are you working for?" I swear I don't know what you're talking about." "Wrong answer." Lucien drove his fist into the noble's stomach and felt ribs crack. Cassian collapsed, gasping and wheezing, and Lucien dragged him upright by his hair. "You have 10 seconds to tell me everything you know about the conspiracy. Who's running it, where they're hiding, what their endgame is. 10 seconds, or I start breaking bones until you can't remember your own name. Please, I'm not." 9. 8. "It was Heron," Cassian screamed. "Lord Heron has been coordinating everything. He recruited most of us, promised we'd have power when the new regime took over." "Where is he now?" "I don't know. He said to scatter after the meeting, said he'd contact us when it was safe." "Who else?" Cassian gave him 3 more names, all nobles who'd been at the council meeting, all people Lucien had trusted with various aspects of governance. Each name was another knife to whatever remained of his ability to trust anyone. Lucien dropped the noble and turned to the guards who'd been following at a distance. "Arrest him. Anyone whose name I've mentioned tonight goes to the dungeons, the cells that didn't burn." The guards moved to comply, and Lucien continued his hunt. He found the second conspirator in the library, a merchant lord named Victor Thane, who'd been helping Celine negotiate trade agreements. The man saw Lucien coming and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go in a locked-down palace. Lucien caught him before he made it 10 feet. This interrogation was shorter and more brutal. Lucien had stopped caring about restraint or procedure or anything except extracting information as quickly as possible. Victor gave up everything within minutes: meeting locations, communication methods, the full list of nobles involved. 23 names total, almost a quarter of the active council. It was a purge waiting to happen, a conspiracy so deep and widespread that rooting it out would destabilize the entire government. But Lucien was past caring about stability. By the time he'd worked through 6 interrogations, his hands were bloody and his voice was hoarse from shouting, and guards were bringing him prisoners faster than he could question them. The palace had transformed into a war zone, soldiers dragging nobles from their chambers in chains, while servants cowered in corners and tried to stay invisible. This was the tyrant's way, the old way, the way Lucien had sworn to abandon. But it was working. Within 3 hours, he'd dismantled the conspiracy, arrested 47 people, and extracted enough confessions to ensure every single one of them would hang. But Lord Heron remained missing. The spy master had vanished the moment the lockdown began, slipping through security with the ease of someone who designed that security himself. Vera's soldiers had torn apart his chambers and found them empty except for a single note addressed to Lucian. The note was written in Heron's precise handwriting, and it burned worse than any wound. Your Majesty, by the time you read this, your queen will be dead or dying, and your empire will be tearing itself apart. I want you to know that none of this was personal. You were simply in the way of progress. Your father understood how to rule, through absolute power and absolute fear. You tried to soften that legacy, tried to build something gentler, and in doing so, you made yourself weak. The new empire that rises from your ashes will be stronger for your failure. Your attempts at reform showed us exactly what not to do. And your precious partnership with Celine demonstrated why love has no place in governance. Thank you for the lesson. I suspect we'll never meet again, but know that I bear you no ill will. You were simply the wrong king at the wrong time, trying to fix what was never broken. The next ruler will not make your mistakes. Lucian read the note 3 times and felt something break that he hadn't known could still break. Because Heron was right about one thing. Love had no place in governance if governance meant surviving in a world of conspiracies and assassinations and people willing to burn entire buildings full of prisoners just to cover their tracks. But Celine had taught him something Heron would never understand. That the only thing worth ruling for was love. That an empire built on fear might survive, but it would never thrive. That the brutal calculus of power meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. And Lucien would be damned if he let Heron's vision of cold efficiency replace what he and Celine had been trying to build. He left the spymaster's chambers and went to find the real Captain Vera. She was coordinating the arrests in the Great Hall, her face grim but determined. Status? Lucian demanded. 47 arrested and secured. 3 died resisting. The rest are talking fast enough that we'll have the full conspiracy mapped by morning, but Heron's in the wind. Every exit was sealed, but he got out somehow. Secret passages? We're searching them now, but the palace has hundreds, and he knows them all. He could be anywhere. Then we make him come to us. Vera looked at him sharply. How? By giving him what he wants. He thinks he's won because Celine's dying, and I've reverted to the tyrant, so we let him think that. We spread word that the queen didn't survive surgery, that I've declared martial law and suspended all reforms, that I'm executing conspirators in the courtyard at dawn. That might actually start a civil war, sir. It might, but it'll also draw Heron out of hiding. He'll want to see his victory, want to watch the empire burn, and when he surfaces, we take him. And if the queen actually doesn't survive? Lucian's expression went cold enough to freeze blood. Then I'll burn this empire to ash myself and rule the ruins until I find every single person who had a hand in killing her. No trials, no mercy, no reforms, just death so complete and terrible that history will remember this as the winter the Northern Empire drowned in blood. Vera held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll spread the word. Do it quietly. And Vera, sir, if anyone asks if the queen is really dead, tell them you don't know. Let the uncertainty spread. Fear of what might be true is more useful than certainty. The captain left to execute his orders, and Lucien stood alone in the great hall surrounded by the symbols of power that suddenly felt hollow. Crown and throne and authority that meant nothing if Celine died. If the woman who'd made him want to be better stopped breathing, then all of this, the palace, the empire, the reforms, became just elaborate set dressing for a tragedy. He needed to see her. The royal chambers were locked down tighter than a military installation. Guards at every entrance and physicians moving in and out with expressions that gave nothing away. Lucien walked past them without acknowledgement and entered the room where Celine lay on their bed, surrounded by medical equipment and the smell of herbs and fear. She looked impossibly small beneath the heavy blankets. Her face was white as snow except for the bruising around her eyes and the fever flush on her cheeks. Her breathing was so shallow that Lucien had to watch closely to confirm she was still alive. The physician looked up when Lucien entered. We've stopped the bleeding and stitched the internal damage, but she's lost too much blood and infection is setting in. The next 24 hours will be critical. Lucien sat beside the bed and took Celine's hand. It was cold, her fingers limp in his grip. Has she woken at all? No, Your Majesty, and that might be a mercy. The pain when she does wake will be considerable. Then manage the pain. We're doing everything we can. The physician and his apprentices withdrew to give them privacy, though Lucian knew they were listening from the antechamber. He didn't care. Let them hear, let the whole palace hear what the tyrant king said to his dying queen. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for all of it. For driving you away. For not protecting you. For trying to be something I'm not when you needed me to be exactly what I was." Celine didn't respond. Just lay there breathing her shallow breaths while Lucien held her hand and felt the weight of every failure crushing him. "I found them. The conspirators. Heron was running the whole thing, just like you suspected. He's gone now, but I'll find him. I'll find every single person who had a hand in this, and I'll make them pay in ways that'll make my father look merciful." He paused, searching her face for any sign she could hear him. "You asked me to promise I wouldn't become him again. Wouldn't let them turn me back into the monster. But I can't keep that promise, Celine. Not if keeping it means losing you. Not if being better gets you killed." Her fingers twitched in his grip. Just a small movement, but it made his heart stop. "Celine?" Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused, and clouded with pain. It took her a moment to recognize him, another moment to remember why she was in this bed with fire burning through her side. "You came back," she whispered. "I never left." "Liar." She tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "You're already gone. Can see it in your eyes. The man who tried to reform. He's dead." Lucien wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come because she was right. The man who'd knelt in that frozen watchtower and promised to be better had died the moment he'd found her bleeding in the council chamber. "I'm doing what I have to do," he said instead. "No. You're doing what's easy. What feels right. Revenge always feels right. It's not revenge, it's justice. Justice doesn't require torture, doesn't require ruling through fear. It does if fear is the only language the Empire understands." Celine's breathing was getting labored, the conversation taking too much energy, but she forced the words out anyway. "Then you've already lost. Because fear gets you obedience, not loyalty. Gets you survival, not prosperity. And when you die, there'll be nothing left but ashes and people celebrating that the tyrant is finally gone." The observation hit harder than any blade could because Lucien knew she was right. Knew that returning to his father's methods would win him the Empire, but lose him everything that made the Empire worth having. But he also knew that noble intentions meant nothing if you were dead. "I can't lose you," he said quietly. "I can't watch you die and then pretend to be civilized about hunting down the people who killed you. I'm not that strong." "Yes, you are." "I'm really not." "Then find that strength. Because if you don't, if you let this turn you into the monster, then I died for nothing. Everything we built dies with me. And they win. Heron wins. The conspiracy wins. Fear wins." Her hand tightened in his with what little strength she had left. "Don't let them win, Lucien." Then her eyes closed and she was unconscious again, her breathing evening out into the shallow rhythm of someone whose body had shut down everything except the most basic functions. The physician emerged from the antechamber. "She needs rest, Your Majesty, and you need to let her have it." Lucien stood slowly, still holding Celine's hand. He'd come to this room ready to make promises he knew he couldn't keep, ready to tell her he'd honor her wishes and continue the work of reform even as he planned to do the exact opposite. But hearing her voice, seeing the certainty in her eyes, even through the pain and fever, changed something. Not because he suddenly believed she was right, not because he'd magically found the strength to be the better man she needed, but because losing her respect would hurt worse than losing the Empire. And somewhere in the twisted wreckage of his priorities, that mattered more than revenge. He released her hand and left the chamber. Vera was waiting outside with a report about the ongoing arrests and searches for Heron. "Change of plans, Lucien," Yen said. "Stop spreading the rumor that the Queen is dead." "Sir, the Queen is alive and recovering. Make sure everyone knows, especially Heron. That'll put a target on her back. If the conspirators know she survived, then they'll come for her, and when they do, we'll be ready." Vera studied him for a long moment. "This is a dangerous game, Your Majesty. Everything about ruling is dangerous, but Celine's right. We can't fight fear with more fear. We have to offer something better, or we're just replacing one tyranny with another. So what's the play? We use her survival as proof that the conspiracy failed. We put the arrested nobles on trial with full transparency so everyone can see exactly how deep the rot went. We offer clemency to anyone who confesses and cooperates. And we make it clear that the old regime is dead. No more ruling through terror, no more paranoia, no more treating subjects like enemies. That's a lot of faith in people who just tried to kill you both. It is. But it's also the only way forward that doesn't end with me becoming exactly what Heron accused me of being. Vera nodded slowly. And when Heron makes his move, then I kill him myself. Quickly and without ceremony. Not because I want revenge, but because some threats can't be reformed or negotiated with. They can only be eliminated. The captain left to relay the new orders, and Lucy Sien stood in the corridor outside Celine's chambers, listening to her breathe through the door, and felt the weight of what he'd just committed to settling onto his shoulders. This was the harder path, the one that required restraint when every instinct screamed for blood, the one that meant showing mercy to people who'd tried to murder his wife, the one that demanded he trust in systems and laws instead of his own judgment. It was the path Celine had been trying to lead him down for years, and Lucien was finally ready to walk it. Not because he'd suddenly become noble or enlightened, not because he believed deep down that people were fundamentally good or that justice would prevail, but because Celine believed those things. And if loving her meant trying to see the world through her eyes, then he'd spend the rest of his life learning how to do that, even if it killed him, especially if it killed him, because dying while trying to be better was preferable to living as the monster he'd always been. The next 12 hours were a study in controlled chaos. Word spread through the palace that the queen had survived, and the effect was immediate. Servants who'd been cowering in corners emerged with renewed purpose. Guards stood straighter at their posts. Even the arrested conspirators seemed to deflate, their certainty of victory evaporating in the face of Celine's stubborn refusal to die. Lucien used the momentum to push through reforms he'd been considering but hadn't had the courage to implement. He dissolved the noble council entirely and replaced it with a mixed assembly of merchants, scholars, and common citizens elected by their communities. He opened the palace archives to public inspection so everyone could see exactly how much corruption had been festering in the government. He ordered full audits of every noble house's finances and promised that anyone caught embezzling would face the same justice regardless of their title or bloodline. It was radical, unprecedented, the kind of sweeping change that should have taken years to implement. But Lucien had learned that crisis created opportunity, and the conspiracy had handed him a crisis so severe that even the most conservative voices couldn't argue against dramatic action. The trials began at dawn on the second day. Lucien presided with Vera at his side, and for the first time in his reign, he allowed the proceedings to be open to public observation. Citizens packed the galleries, watching their rulers being held accountable with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. Each conspirator was given the chance to speak in their own defense. Each one had access to legal counsel. Each one faced a jury of their peers instead of the king's arbitrary judgment. It was slow and frustrating and frequently infuriating when guilty people exploited the system to avoid consequences. But it was justice. Real justice. The kind that served the empire instead of just the crown. And with each verdict, with each sentence handed down through process instead of royal decree, Lucien felt the empire shifting beneath him, becoming something different, something that might actually survive his eventual death instead of collapsing the moment his iron grip loosened. But Lord Heron remained missing. The spymaster had vanished so completely that Lucien started to wonder if he'd left the capital entirely, fled to one of the rebel territories or the eastern kingdoms where he could start over with a new identity and new schemes. Then on the third day, a message arrived. It was delivered by a street urchin who claimed a hooded stranger had given him a silver coin to bring it to the palace. The message was written in Heron's handwriting and addressed to the king. Lucien read it in his study while Vera stood guard at the door. Your Majesty, I must admit I underestimated you. I expected the Queen's injury to break you completely, to send you spiraling back into the comfortable brutality of your father's reign. Instead, you've done something far more interesting. You've chosen to be weak on purpose. The trials, the reforms, the public accountability, it's all very noble, very inspiring, and it will destroy you within a year. Because the truth you refuse to accept is that empires cannot be governed by consensus. They require singular vision, absolute authority, and the willingness to make choices that gentler souls would shy away from. Your father understood this. Malric understood this. Even I understand this. But you? You've let love make you soft, let hope make you vulnerable. Let the naive belief that people are fundamentally good blind you to the reality that most people are fundamentally selfish. I could kill you easily now. Could slip poison into your wine or a blade between your ribs. Could arrange an accident that would look natural enough that no one would question it. But I won't, because watching you fail will be far more satisfying than simply removing you. Watching your reforms collapse under the weight of their own idealism. Watching your subjects betray the trust you've placed in them. Watching Celine realize that the man she tried to create cannot survive in the world we actually inhabit. That will be my revenge. Enjoy your victory, Your Majesty. It won't last. Lucien set the letter down and was surprised to find himself smiling, because Heron had made a fatal mistake. He'd assumed that Lucien's choice to reform was born from weakness or naivety, that showing mercy meant being soft, that trusting people meant being blind to their selfishness. But Lucien had lived too long and seen too much to be naive about human nature. He knew people were selfish, knew they'd exploit kindness if given the chance, knew that trust without verification was just stupidity with better branding. But he also knew something Heron didn't, that ruling through fear worked right up until the moment it didn't. That empires built on terror collapsed the instant the tyrant showed weakness. That absolute authority created absolute dependency, and the moment the authority died, everything fell apart. His father had proven that, had ruled for 30 years through sheer force of will, and died leaving behind an empire so fragile that Lucien had spent his entire reign trying to hold it together through the same brutal methods. The cycle would continue forever, unless someone had the courage to break it. And Lucien had finally found that courage, not in his own strength, but in Celine's certainty that something better was possible. "Vera," he said quietly. "Sir?" "Let Heron watch. Let him see the reforms succeed or fail on their own merits. And if they fail, then he was right, and we'll deal with the consequences. But if they succeed, if we actually manage to build something stronger than fear, then his entire worldview collapses, and he's just another bitter old man who couldn't adapt to a changing world. And if he tries something while we're giving him time to watch, then we respond with everything we have. But we don't hunt him. We don't turn this into a chase. We focus on building what we promised to build and trust that doing the work is more important than punishing everyone who opposes it." Vera looked skeptical but nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." She left and Lucien returned to Celine's chambers where the physicians reported cautious optimism about her recovery. The fever had broken. The wound was healing without infection. She was still weak and in considerable pain, but she'd regained consciousness for longer periods and could speak without gasping. Lucien sat beside her bed and told her about the trials, the reforms, Heron's letter, and his decision to let the spymaster watch from the shadows instead of hunting him down. Celine listened with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in days. "That's brave," she said when he finished. "It's stupid. Any tactical assessment would say we're leaving an enemy operative loose to sabotage everything we're trying to build. But you're doing it anyway, because you were right. About all of it. Fear can't build the empire we need. Only trust can. And if I can't trust my own judgment enough to let the reforms succeed or fail without controlling every variable, then I'm not really committed to changing." Celine's hand found his. "I'm proud of you." "Don't be. I'm terrified this is going to blow up in our faces and get us both killed. That's what makes it brave. Doing the right thing despite the fear instead of avoiding the fear by doing the easy thing." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just breathing the same air and existing in a moment of peace that felt stolen from the chaos surrounding them. Then Celine said quietly, "Heron's going to make his move during the winter festival. How do you know?" "Because that's when the maximum number of people will be watching, when success or failure will be most visible. He won't be able to resist the dramatic timing. You think he'll try to assassinate us? I think he'll try to prove we're wrong, that reform makes us vulnerable, that the empire can't survive without fear. So we cancel the festival, lock down the city, hunt him properly instead of waiting for him to strike. No. We proceed as planned. We show the people that we're not afraid, that we trust them enough to celebrate together despite the threats, and we prepare for whatever Heron throws at us. That's insane. Probably. But it's also the only way to prove that the new empire is different from the old one, that we're not going to let terror dictate our choices anymore. Lucien wanted to argue, wanted to insist that prudence mattered more than symbolism, that getting them both killed wouldn't prove anything, except that Heron was right about love making them weak. But looking at Celine's determined expression, he understood that this was the line she wouldn't cross. This was where reform became real instead of just rhetoric. So he nodded and started planning for a festival that would either mark the beginning of a new empire or the end of everything they'd tried to build. The Winter Festival was 3 days away, and somewhere in the shadows of the frozen capital, Lord Heron was planning his masterstroke. The confrontation that would determine whether love and trust could survive in a world built on fear and blood. The Winter Festival dawned cold and clear, the kind of morning where the sky looked like polished steel and every breath turned to frost in the air. The capital had transformed overnight into something almost beautiful. Ice sculptures lined the main streets, their surfaces catching the weak sunlight and throwing rainbows across the snow. Merchants had set up stalls selling hot cider and roasted chestnuts, their braziers sending columns of warmth into the frozen morning. And everywhere, citizens emerged from their homes with cautious optimism, testing whether it was safe to celebrate after weeks of conspiracy and bloodshed. Lucien stood on the palace balcony watching the city come alive and felt the weight of every decision that had brought them to this moment. 3 days ago, Celine had been dying in their bed with a blade wound that should have killed her. Now she was insisting on attending the festival despite the physician's protests, determined to show the empire that fear hadn't won. She emerged onto the balcony wrapped in furs thick enough to hide the bandages beneath, her face still pale but her eyes sharp with the same stubborn fire that had made Lucien fall in love with her 7 years ago. "You don't have to do this," he said without turning around. "You've proven your point. No one would blame you for staying in bed and letting your body heal. I would blame me." She moved to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "This festival is the first real test of whether people trust us. If I hide in the palace while they're expected to celebrate in the open, what message does that send? That you're recovering from nearly being murdered and have the good sense to prioritize survival over symbolism." Celine smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Since when do you care about good sense?" "Since I almost lost you." The admission hung between them, raw and unguarded in a way Lucien still wasn't comfortable with. 20 years of building walls around his emotions didn't disappear just because he'd decided to be better. But Celine had taught him that discomfort was part of growth, that the things worth saying were usually the hardest to voice. Her hand found his and squeezed once. "You didn't lose me. I'm still here, still fighting, still refusing to let bastards like Heron dictate how we rule. He's going to make his move today." "I know. And you're still determined to walk out there and give him a perfect target." "I'm determined to show the Empire that we're not afraid, that we trust our people enough to be vulnerable among them. That's the whole point of reform, Lucien. If we can't practice what we preach, then we're just hypocrites with better rhetoric." Lucien wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come because she was right. Every tactical instinct he possessed screamed that this was suicide, that exposing themselves publicly was exactly what Heron wanted, that prudence mattered more than symbolism. But reform had never been about prudence. It had been about gambling everything on the possibility that people were better than their worst impulses. That trust could build something stronger than fear. That vulnerability was a kind of strength instead of just stupidity with noble intentions. So Lucien nodded and started preparing for a festival that would either prove them right or get them both killed. The security arrangements were the most comprehensive in the Empire's history. Captain Vera had positioned soldiers at every entrance to the festival grounds, their armor hidden beneath civilian clothing so they wouldn't alarm the crowd. Archers covered the rooftops with sightlines that overlapped to ensure no blind spots. And circulating through the celebration itself were dozens of plainclothes guards trained to spot threats before they materialized. But all the security in the world couldn't eliminate every risk. There were too many people, too many variables, too many ways for a determined assassin to get close enough to strike. Lucien and Celine walked through the festival together, moving slowly because Celine's wound made anything faster than a careful stroll excruciating. Citizens approached with gifts and well-wishes, their faces showing the tentative hope of people who'd lived through hell and were trying to believe that better days might actually come. Each conversation was a test, each handshake a vulnerability, each moment in the open a chance for Heron to prove that reform made them weak. But nothing happened. Hours passed and the festival continued without incident. Musicians played traditional songs that Lucian hadn't heard since childhood. Dancers performed in the central square, their movements precise and joyful despite the cold. And everywhere, people laughed and celebrated with the kind of genuine pleasure that couldn't be forced or faked. It was beautiful in ways that Lucian had forgotten empires could be. Not the beauty of conquest or power or architectural grandeur, but the simpler beauty of people choosing to come together despite every reason to stay isolated and afraid. This was what they'd been fighting for, this moment of community and trust, this proof that something other than fear could hold a kingdom together. Lucien was starting to think maybe Heron had fled after all, that the spymaster's letter had been nothing but empty threats designed to make them paranoid, when Celine stiffened beside him. He followed her gaze and saw a figure standing at the edge of the crowd, hooded and still in a way that set him apart from the celebrating citizens. The posture was wrong, the isolation deliberate, the positioning calculated for maximum visibility. Lord Heron had come to watch his kingdom burn. Lucian's hand moved to his sword, but Celine caught his wrist. Not here. Not in front of everyone. He tried to kill you, and if you cut him down in the middle of a festival, you prove every accusation he's made about you being a tyrant who can't control his temper. We do this the right way. There is no right way to deal with someone who orchestrated the murder of 50 prisoners and nearly killed my wife. Then find one, because that's what being better means. Making the harder choice even when every instinct screams for blood. Lucian looked at her and saw the absolute certainty in her eyes. This was the line she wouldn't let him cross. The moment where he either committed fully to reform or reverted to the comfortable brutality of his father's reign. He released his sword and gestured to Vera, who was stationed nearby. The captain approached with the fluid efficiency of someone reading situations before words were needed. Bring him in. Alive and unharmed. Full escort. No violence unless he initiates it. Vera nodded and moved toward Heron with 4 soldiers flanking her. The spymaster saw them coming and made no attempt to flee, just stood there with that infuriating smile, waiting to be arrested like this was all part of some larger performance. The crowd had noticed the confrontation now, conversations dying as citizens turned to watch their rulers dealing with a threat in real time. This was the test Heron had orchestrated. The moment where Lucian's commitment to justice would be measured against his instinct for revenge. Vera reached Heron and spoke quietly. The spymaster responded with something that made her jaw tighten, but she maintained her composure and gestured for him to accompany her peacefully. For a moment, Lucian thought it might actually work. Thought they might arrest Heron without incident and prove that the new empire could handle threats through law instead of violence. Then Heron moved. It wasn't a weapon he pulled, but something smaller and more insidious. A vial of clear liquid that he raised above his head with theatrical flourish, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. Citizens of the Northern Empire. You've been told your rulers have reformed, that the age of tyranny is over, that you can trust them to govern with wisdom instead of fear. He paused, letting the words sink in. But I know the truth about your king. I served him for years, watched him make decisions you never heard about, saw the bodies he buried to maintain his power. And I'm here to tell you that men like Lucian Draven don't change. They just get better at hiding what they really are. Lucien felt Celine's hand tighten on his arm, felt the weight of 1,000 eyes watching to see how he'd respond. Every word Heron spoke was designed to provoke, to goad him into the violent reaction that would prove the spymaster's point. So he did the hardest thing he'd ever done in 20 years of ruling. He stood there and let Heron speak. Your queen nearly died 3 days ago, murdered by conspirators I helped coordinate. And your merciful, reformed king wants to give me a trial, wants to prove he's better than his father by extending me the same justice he'd give any citizen. Heron's smile widened. But here's what he's not telling you. Here's what none of them will admit. Justice is a luxury empires can't afford. Real power requires decisive action, requires eliminating threats before they eliminate you. And your king's refusal to do that? It's not virtue. It's weakness. He held up the vial. This is nightshade extract, enough to kill everyone within 20 feet. I could throw this into the crowd right now and watch dozens of you die while your reformed rulers stand frozen by their commitment to process and law. The square had gone deathly quiet. Citizens backing away from Heron in widening circles, creating a kill zone around him. Soldiers had their crossbows trained but couldn't fire without risking the vial breaking and releasing its poison. Lucien felt the old instincts rising, the urge to charge forward and break Heron's neck before he could throw that vial. To protect his people the way he'd always protected them, through overwhelming force and the willingness to sacrifice himself before allowing others to suffer. But that was the tyrant's answer, quick and brutal, and completely missing the point. Celine's voice cut through his thoughts, quiet enough that only he could hear. Let me handle this. He wanted to refuse, wanted to insist that protecting her was his responsibility. But reform meant trusting her judgment even when every protective instinct screamed otherwise. So he stepped aside and let Celine move forward. She walked toward Heron with slow, deliberate steps, each one clearly costing her pain but her face showing none of it. The crowd parted for her, creating a path between the queen and the spymaster. When she was close enough to speak without shouting, she stopped. "You're right," she said. Her voice carried across the square with surprising strength. Justice is hard. It's slow and frustrating, and sometimes the guilty exploit it to avoid consequences. And there are moments when I wish we could just eliminate threats the old way instead of dealing with trials and evidence and all the messy complications of governing through law. Heron's smile faltered slightly. "But here's what you're missing," Celine continued. "Fear works until it doesn't. Tyranny maintains order until the tyrant dies, and everything collapses because no system exists beyond one person's will. We've tried ruling through strength and violence and elimination of threats, and it nearly destroyed this empire." She took another step forward. "So yes, we're going to give you a trial. We're going to extend you the same justice we'd give any citizen. Not because you deserve it, but because our people deserve to live in an empire where law matters more than the whims of whoever holds power." "Then you're fools," Heron said, "and I'm about to prove it." His hand tightened on the vial. Lucien started moving, but Celine was faster. She closed the remaining distance between them in 3 quick steps that must have felt like knives through her healing wound, grabbed Heron's wrist with both hands, and twisted. The vial flew from his grip, arcing through the air in a trajectory that would have shattered against the cobblestones and released its poison across the crowd. But Lucien had been moving too. He dove and caught it inches before impact, rolling to absorb the momentum and coming up with the vial intact in his hand. The square erupted, citizens cheering, soldiers moving in to restrain Heron, Vera shouting orders to secure the scene. And in the center of it all, Celine standing over the spymaster with blood seeping through her bandages from the exertion but triumph blazing in her eyes. Lucien crossed to her in 3 strides and wrapped an arm around her waist before she collapsed. She leaned into him, her breathing labored but her voice steady when she spoke. "Did we just prove him wrong or prove him right?" "Little bit of both," Lucien admitted. "You defended the people through action instead of waiting for process to save them. I caught the poison instead of letting law handle a threat that was too immediate for trials. So, we're hypocrites. We're pragmatists. We believe in reform, but we're not suicidal about it." Celine managed a tired laugh. "I can live with that." Vera had Heron in chains now, the spymaster's theatrical confidence evaporating into something smaller and more desperate. He looked at Lucien and Celine with eyes that held equal parts hatred and incomprehension. "You should have killed me," he said, "when you had the chance. Should have ended this cleanly." "Probably," Lucien agreed, "but then we'd just be proving you right about power requiring ruthlessness. This way we get to prove something different." "Which is what exactly?" "That we can be strong without being brutal. That we can eliminate threats without abandoning our principles entirely. That the empire you think requires tyranny can actually survive on something better." "You'll fail. The old ways exist because they work. Maybe. But at least we'll fail trying to build something worth ruling instead of succeeding at maintaining something that should have died decades ago." Heron had no answer to that. Vera led him away toward the dungeons that had been rebuilt and reinforced after the fire, toward a trial that would be public and fair and probably frustrating in its adherence to process. But it would be justice, real justice, the kind that served the empire instead of just the crown. The festival resumed slowly, citizens processing what they'd witnessed and gradually returning to celebration with the tentative relief of people who'd survived another crisis. Musicians picked up their instruments. Dancers returned to their routines. And the celebration that had been interrupted by Heron's theatrics rebuilt itself through sheer collective will. Lucienne helped Celine to a bench near the central square where they could watch without standing. Her face was white with pain and exertion, blood soaking through the bandages beneath her furs. "The physician is going to kill me for this," she said. "Get in line. I'm going to kill you first for risking your life when you're barely healed." Had to be done. Did it, though? We had soldiers positioned, backup plans, contingencies for exactly this scenario, none of which would have stopped him from throwing that vial. Sometimes the only way to protect people is to put yourself between them and the threat. That's my line. I learned from the best. They sat in silence for a while, watching the festival continue around them, watching the empire they'd nearly died for choosing to celebrate, despite every reason to stay afraid. Watching people trust them enough to be vulnerable in public. This was what victory looked like. Not glorious or dramatic. Just ordinary people living ordinary lives because they believed tomorrow would be safe enough to plan for. A small girl approached their bench with a flower she'd woven from festival ribbons. She offered it to Celine with the kind of fearless generosity that only children possessed, unaware that she was giving a gift to someone who'd nearly died defending the right of citizens to approach their rulers without terror. Celine took the flower with shaking hands and smiled through obvious pain. "Thank you. It's beautiful. My mama says you saved us." The girl's voice was high and clear. "Says you and the king are making things better. We're trying. Are you going to keep trying even when people are mean to you?" The question was so simple and so devastating that Celine had to take a moment before answering. "Yes. We're going to keep trying, even when it's hard. Even when people doubt us, even when we're not sure we're doing the right thing." The girl nodded seriously, processing this with the grave intensity of childhood. "Good, because trying is important even if you don't always win." She ran back to her mother, leaving Celine holding the ribbon flower and Lucien sitting beside her, feeling like he'd just witnessed something profound. "Out of the mouths of children," Celine said quietly. "Wisdom. We spent decades trying to learn, and she just stated it like obvious fact. Maybe that's the problem. We complicate things with strategy and politics and power dynamics when the truth is simpler than we want to admit. Which is what? That trying matters. That the effort to be better has value even when the results are imperfect. That showing up and doing the work is more important than achieving some theoretical perfection." Lucien turned to look at her, this woman who'd walked into a blizzard because he'd called her a traitor, who'd survived imprisonment and assassination attempts, and was now sitting in a public square with a stab wound that should have killed her, still insisting that hope mattered more than cynicism. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you keep believing when everything we've seen suggests people are terrible and empires are doomed and reform is just naivety with better branding?" Celine was quiet for a long moment, watching the festival with eyes that had seen too much darkness but still searched for light. Then she said, "I don't believe people are fundamentally good. I've seen too much corruption and selfishness to think that. But I do believe they're capable of being better when given the chance. And I'd rather spend my life creating conditions where that better version can emerge than accepting the worst as inevitable. Even when accepting the worst would be easier? Especially then, because easy answers are usually wrong answers. And I didn't survive everything we've been through just to give up and rule through fear like everyone expects." She looked at him, and Lucien saw the challenge in her eyes. "The question is whether you can do the same. Whether you can keep choosing the harder path, even when your instincts scream for the brutal efficiency of the old ways." Lucien thought about his father, thought about 20 years of ruling through violence and intimidation, thought about how easy it would be to revert to those patterns, to justify tyranny as necessity, and convince himself that strength required cruelty. Then he thought about Celine bleeding in the council chamber, thought about the empire tearing itself apart, thought about the girl who'd just given them a ribbon flower and asked if they'd keep trying even when people were mean, and he made a choice that would define the rest of his reign. "I can't promise I'll always choose right. Can't promise I won't fall back into old patterns when things get desperate. But I can promise I'll try, that I'll keep pushing myself to be better even when better feels impossible. That's all I'm asking. It's asking for everything. I know, but you're capable of it. You proved that when you carried me out of that fortress, when you knelt in front of the court and admitted your failures, when you gave Heron a trial instead of executing him in the street. Those were individual moments. What you're asking for is sustained transformation. So sustain it, one moment at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. She stood slowly, her body protesting every movement, and offered him her hand. Starting now. We've got an empire to rebuild, and about 1,000 people waiting to see if we collapse under the weight of our own idealism. Lucien took her hand and stood. Together they walked back through the festival, two scarred rulers trying to prove that love and trust could survive in a world built on fear. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no magical transformation where all problems disappeared and everyone lived happily ever after. The empire was still fractured. Rebels still operated in distant territories. Noble houses still schemed for advantage. And Lucien's instincts toward violence and control didn't vanish just because he'd decided to be better. But something had shifted. Some fundamental reorientation of priorities that made the old ways feel less like necessity and more like failure of imagination. The weeks following the Winter Festival brought challenges that tested their commitment to reform daily. The trial of the conspirators revealed corruption so deep that cleaning it out required dismantling entire government structures. 3 more assassination attempts were thwarted, each one proving that enemies remained willing to exploit any opening that mercy provided. And twice Lucien made decisions that looked like regression, executing a traitor who'd poisoned the water supply, burning a village that had harbored enemies of the crown. Each time Celine forced him to explain his reasoning, to justify why violence had been necessary, to prove that he'd exhausted every other option before reverting to the brutal efficiency he was trying to leave behind. It was exhausting, frustrating. Sometimes it felt like being constantly audited by someone determined to catch him backsliding. But it worked, because knowing he'd have to defend every harsh decision to Celine made Lucien think harder about whether harsh decisions were actually required. Made him search for solutions that didn't involve bloodshed, made him consult advisors and consider alternatives, and occasionally discover that the problems he thought required violence could be solved through negotiation or incentives or simple patience. He was learning, slowly and imperfectly, but learning nonetheless. 6 months after the Winter Festival, the Eastern Territories reopened their borders in exchange for trade concessions that Celine negotiated. House Corvain and House Brecken formally rejoined the empire under new terms that limited their autonomy, but gave them representation in the Reformed Council. And the first citizen elections were held to replace the Noble Assembly with a mixed government that actually reflected the people it claimed to serve. It was messy. The elected representatives fought constantly, deadlocking on basic decisions and forcing Lucien to mediate disputes he'd previously have settled with threats. The learning curve was brutal for everyone involved, but it was working. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and frustrations and moments where Lucien wanted to just seize control and make the decisions himself because collective governance was so much slower than tyranny, but working nonetheless. The empire that emerged from that brutal winter looked nothing like the one Lucien's father had built. It was smaller. 3 territories had permanently broken away, choosing independence over the uncertainty of reformed governance. It was messier. Democratic processes were slower and more contentious than royal decree. And it was weaker in the traditional military sense. Lucien had reduced the standing army and redirected resources toward infrastructure and education. But it was also more stable, more resilient, more capable of surviving the eventual death of its rulers because it didn't depend entirely on one person's will. Lucy stood on the palace balcony one evening and watched the city below, seeing lights in windows and smoke from chimneys and all the small signs of ordinary life continuing without terror. Celine joined him, her wound finally healed enough that she could move without wincing. She'd been in meetings all day with the Trade Council, negotiating shipping routes and tariff structures with the kind of patient attention to detail that Lucien had never possessed. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Brutal. Lord Cassian wanted preferential treatment for his merchant fleet, and Merchant Vela threatened to withdraw her support if we didn't address labor conditions in the southern ports. Took 6 hours to reach a compromise everyone could tolerate. 6 hours you could have saved by just making a decision and forcing them to accept it." True. But then we'd be back to ruling through authority instead of consensus. And we've seen how well that worked. She leaned against the balcony railing, staring out at the city with the same mixture of affection and exasperation that Lucien had learned meant she was simultaneously proud and exhausted. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "The reforms. The sharing of power. Everything we've built at the cost of efficiency and control. Celine was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Every single day. There are moments when I want to just seize control and make the hard decisions without debate or discussion or all the messy complications of governing with partners instead of subjects. But I also remember what the empire looked like under the old system. Remember the fear and corruption and the certainty that everything would collapse the moment you showed weakness. And I'd rather deal with the frustrations of democratic governance than return to that. Even though it's harder, especially because it's harder. Easy answers usually mean someone else is paying the cost we're too comfortable to notice." She turned to look at him, and Lucien saw the same fire in her eyes that had first drawn him to her 7 years ago. The same stubborn refusal to accept that cruelty was inevitable or that power required brutality. "How about you?" she asked. "Regrets?" "Thousands. Every day I wish I could just give orders and have them followed without question. Every negotiation feels like wasted time. Every compromise feels like weakness. So why keep doing it?" Lucien thought about the question, about all the reasons he could give that would sound noble or enlightened or befitting a reformed ruler. But the truth was simpler and more selfish. Because you asked me to. Because loving you means trying to see the world through your eyes. And because I'd rather struggle to be the man you believe I can be than succeed at being the monster I used to be. Celine smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "That's probably the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "It's pathetic is what it is. A king whose entire reformation hinges on not disappointing his wife. There are worse motivations. Name one: fear, greed, hunger for power. At least love points you toward building something instead of just maintaining control." She took his hand and they stood there watching the city. Two people who'd nearly destroyed each other, learning how to build something worth preserving. The story could end there, with the empire reformed and the relationship healed and everything trending toward stability. With Lucien having learned his lessons and Celine having survived her trials, and both of them better for the suffering. But that would be dishonest. Because the truth about transformation is that it never ends. There's no final moment where you become the person you're trying to be and get to stop working at it. No graduation from the school of being better. Just the daily grind of choosing growth over comfort and hoping that the accumulation of right choices eventually outweighs the wrong ones. Lucien and Celine ruled together for another 30 years. They faced rebellions and famines and political crises that made the conspiracy look simple. They made mistakes that cost lives and decisions they'd regret for decades. They fought with each other frequently and bitterly, testing the limits of their partnership and occasionally crossing lines that required serious repair work. But they also built something lasting. An empire where citizens had voice instead of just obedience, where law mattered more than the whims of whoever held power, where the mechanisms of governance could survive the death of individual rulers because the system was larger than any one person. It wasn't perfect. Democratic processes were still messy and slow. Corruption still existed, just more carefully hidden. And there were moments when Lucien's old instincts resurfaced, and he had to be talked down from reverting to the brutal efficiency he'd been trained to employ. But it was better. Measurably and meaningfully better than what had come before. When Lucien died at 63 from wounds sustained defending the northern border against raiders, the empire didn't collapse. The systems he and Celine had built continued functioning. The elected council chose a new leader through process instead of violence, and the transition of power happened without civil war or widespread bloodshed. That was his legacy. Not conquest or fear or the brutal efficiency of tyranny, but the simple proof that empires could survive on trust instead of terror. Celine lived another 7 years after Lucien's death. She spent them teaching the next generation of rulers how to govern with wisdom instead of force, how to see strength in vulnerability and power in partnership, how to choose the harder path even when easy answers beckoned. She died peacefully in her sleep, which felt unfair given how many times she'd nearly died violently. But perhaps that was its own kind of justice. A quiet ending for someone who'd spent her life fighting loudly against the assumption that peace was impossible. The empire they'd built outlasted them both. It fractured and reformed multiple times over the following centuries, adapting to new challenges and new technologies, while maintaining the core principle that governance required consent instead of just compliance. Historians would debate whether their reformation had been successful, whether the costs they paid were justified by the systems they created, whether love had any place in the brutal calculus of power. But in the frozen capital, where Queen Selene Varellus had once disappeared into a blizzard, and Alpha King Lucian Draven had learned what it meant to lose everything, there stood a monument that settled the argument in its own way. Two statues facing each other across a public square. Not king and subject, not conqueror and conquered, but partners standing as equals with their hands reaching toward each other across the space between them. The inscription at the base was simple. They learned that empires are not built by those who refuse to bend, but by those who bend without breaking. That strength lives not in dominance, but in the courage to be vulnerable. That the truest power comes not from making others fear you, but from giving them reason to stand beside you when fear comes calling. And below that, in smaller letters that most people missed unless they were looking closely, was a second inscription added years later by someone who'd lived through that brutal winter. The queen saved the king by refusing to break. The king saved the empire by learning how to bend. And together they proved that even the coldest winter eventually yields to spring. Not because winter loses its power, but because something stronger was waiting beneath the snow all along. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was better than that. It was real. Complicated and messy, and filled with the kind of hard-won wisdom that only comes from surviving your own worst instincts and choosing to be better anyway. It was the story of two people who'd hurt each other and their empire through pride and fear and the assumption that strength required cruelty. Who'd been given a second chance they probably didn't deserve, and who'd spent the rest of their lives trying to prove that people could change if they wanted it badly enough. Whether they succeeded was a matter of perspective, but they tried, even when it was hard, even when people were mean to them. Even when the easier path beckoned and old patterns felt more comfortable than new ones. They kept trying. And sometimes, in a world that offered 1,000 reasons to give up and revert and accept that cruelty was inevitable, trying was the only victory that mattered. The story ends the way it began, with snow falling on the northern capital and the palace standing against the frozen sky. But the palace was different now. Warmer somehow, despite the cold. Filled with voices engaged in heated debate instead of whispered conspiracies. Home to rulers who governed through partnership instead of domination. And if you listened carefully on certain winter nights when the wind howled just right, you could almost hear the echoes of that long-ago argument. The night the queen vanished and the empire started its long journey from tyranny toward something better. Not perfect. Never perfect. But better. Always striving to be better. And in the end, for an empire built on blood and fear, and the assumption that power required brutality, that simple commitment to improvement was the most radical transformation imaginable. The kind of change that started with one king learning to kneel, and one queen refusing to break, and two people choosing to try despite every reason to give up. The kind of change that proved winter doesn't last forever. Not when you're willing to do the hard work of building spring.